Good morning, sir. Can you see and hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This morning we're going to hear from Ms. Swinson.
Yeah.
Please repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that
the evidence I shall give
the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you state your full name, please?
My name is Joanne Kate Swinson.
Thank you very much. Ms. Swinson, you should have in front of you a witness statement.
I do.
Is that dated the 19th of June 2024?
It is.
Could I ask you please to turn to the final page?
Yes, I've done that.
Can you confirm that that is your signature?
Yes, that is my signature.
And can you confirm that that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, this statement is true.
Thank you very much. That witness statement has a unique reference number of WITN 101-90100, and that will be uploaded to the inquiry's website. You are formerly a Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament.
That's right.
You were an MP between 2005 and 2015, and then again between 2017 and 2019. Is that correct?
Yes.
You have been both the deputy leader and then subsequently leader of the Liberal Democrat Party.
Yes, I have.
Relevant for today's purpose, you were Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Employment Relations, Consumer and Postal Affairs between the 6th of September 2012 and the 8th of May 2015. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And that was during the coalition years.
Yes.
At the same time, I think you were also Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Women and Equalities.
Yes.
Some of that time, I think the 18th of December 2013 to the 30th of June 2014, you were also on maternity leave.
Yes, I was.
And your post in both respects was covered by Jenny Wilmot MP, or in just respect of one of those posts?
In both of the ministerial posts, obviously not my constituency work.
Those are two very long ministerial titles. Did you divide your time equally between the two?
The role at BIS, Business Innovation Skills, was a role that took more of my time than the Women and Equalities role. There were more different elements to the brief at BIS, as indeed from the title, Employment Relations, Consumer Affairs and Postal Affairs, which was very wide-ranging, even within those topics, including competition policy and insolvency and European liaison on different issues. So that had more of my time, but obviously the Women and Equalities role also took time. So across the 4 days that I was able to spend on my ministerial commitments during the week, with the other 3 days obviously being spent in my constituency working, I would say probably about 80% of my time was spent on the BIS portfolio.
Thank you very much. I'm going to get into trouble with the stenographer, I imagine, if you don't speak slightly slower, if you may.
I will do my best.
Thank you. Employment relations, consumer and postal affairs. How do you divide that 80% of your time up between the three?
I think in my total ministerial time, probably about 15% might have been spent on postal affairs. I think it would also be worth noting that it was not static, so it would depend on what the issues were at the time. So, for example, during my time as a minister, I took 5 different bills through the House of Commons, and bills just eat your time. You know, hours and hours and hours of debates in committee stage, report stage in Parliament, but all of the preparation in terms of the policy development, the engagement with different groups about what goes into those bills. So at the points where a bill was being taken through, then that would be eating up a huge amount of my time, and none of those bills that I did were in the postal services area. And so that, it varied, but probably on average about 15% on post office. And I note that when I came back from maternity leave, for example, and I had the deep dives on the different areas of my brief, I had those on 6 different areas, of which one was postal affairs. And of course, within postal affairs, there was a broad range of different issues to be considering.
Thank you. In terms of the actual post, Minister for Postal Affairs, did you see your role as being accountable to Parliament for the Post Office?
Yes, definitely parliamentary accountability was a necessary part of the role, not least because Parliament is one of the places where, with the exception of select committees, Post Office officials can't actually themselves answer any questions. So if a question was to be asked in the House of Commons, either written or orally, then it had to be a minister who would be answering that. So that parliamentary accountability was definitely part of the role.
And you're accountable to Parliament for the Post Office. Who is the Post Office accountable to, in your view?
Well, I mean, ultimately the Post Office is accountable to its shareholder, which is the government. And then, of course, in terms of wider general accountability as a public institution through members of the media and others, there are ways in which that accountability operates in other spheres too.
I'd like to take you to a passage from your witness statement. If we could bring up on screen WITN 101 90100. Thank you. It's paragraph 112. That is on page 47. Thank you. If we could scroll down, please. At paragraph 112, you say as follows: I do find the accountability placed on ministers for the Post Office was not matched with the levers available to ministers to affect or influence what the Post Office was doing. It was always made clear to me that it was not for me as minister to interfere with operational matters, and it was only feasible to engage with the most serious and strategically important objective and aims of the Post Office. I'd like to focus on that division. Can you assist us with how you saw operational matters? What were operational matters for you?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is I was never presented with, nor necessarily spent a huge amount of time critiquing what was operational and what was strategic. It wasn't like there was some list of criteria somewhere. It was a division which was interpreted probably with a bit more fluidity than that, but clearly, in terms of strategic matters, that would include issues such as the size and the future sustainability and health of the Post Office network. The context for this being that we had recently had very significant Post Office closures, which every MP in Parliament had been affected by and exercised by. I'd certainly campaigned against Post Office closures in my constituency in Eastern Bartonshire. And I mean, it struck me this was one of the issues which it didn't matter if you were Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrat, SNP, whatever, you cared about your local post offices. So that was a very contentious political issue, and I think we heard from Pat McFadden earlier this week how obviously that was a big issue in the years immediately preceding the coalition government. So therefore, securing the future network, stabilising that network was a very strategically important goal. That was obviously linked to financial sustainability, and one of those areas was the government services, so how to make sure the Post Office could have a sustainable future. Contracts such as the Post Office card account or the driver and vehicle licensing agency, passport renewals, these would be contracts that government could give to Post Office, and as a minister I would be engaged in discussions with other ministers and other departments about trying to make sure Post Office would be a provider. And then there was the long-term issue of mutualisation as well.
Thank you. Another term that we're going to come to is arm's length. Is that something that was ever explained to you as to what that meant in practice between the government and the Post Office, or yourself and the Post Office?
It wasn't defined in a sense of here's a criteria, but it was obviously referenced, not necessarily always with that terminology, but it was referenced in terms of the briefings that I would receive that would say, of course, this is an operational matter. And it did, I mean, to me, I recognised that with the variety of things I was dealing with as a minister, I wasn't in a position to either have the expertise of how to run a company on a day-to-day basis, nor indeed would I have the time to be able to do so. So that operational strategic distinction seemed to make sense to me.
We're going to look at correspondence and we're going to look at particular events, but structurally, what did you see the role of chèques being in respect of the Post Office?
So at this time, chèques were part of BIS, and although they were slightly separate, I think they were on a different floor in the building, I also viewed them really as part of the department. And I mean, when I initially started, I don't think I was told that there was a specific difference. That became clear to me in my time as minister. But I viewed the team of officials in chèques who would come and brief me on Post Office in a similar way that I would view the team who would brief me on competition policy or on employment rights or on insolvency, that these would be teams of officials within the department who were there to support me in my work as minister and to fulfil the duties of the government department. And the differential with chèques was not particularly clear, even when obviously I was aware it was a different section. I was aware there was a slightly different culture within chèques. It was a bit more commercial. They probably, held themselves a little bit more maybe dare I say, sometimes slightly superior in that sense, that they were the ones dealing with the commercial matters. And it had obviously recruited a lot of people from corporate finance or consultancy backgrounds. I probably wasn't aware at the time quite the extent to which that recruitment was not within the normal civil service pools of recruitment.
We're going to see a number of ministerial submissions and briefings. In respect to the Post Office, would they all come from chèques, or would other members of the department?
I wouldn't want to be absolutely categorical, but I think so. I think the main Post Office team was in chèques, and I'm trying to think if there was a kind of example of something. I mean, there would be discussions between private offices sometimes, between my private office and Vince's private office. So, but I mean, I would say the vast majority would come from chèques.
Thank you. There were some structural or personnel changes over the time that you were in office. I think Susanna Story was the Post Office shareholder non-executive director when you first started, and Will Gibson was the head of the Post Office shareholder team in chèques. And then in 2014, Mr. Callard held both of those roles. Is that something that you noticed, that structural change or significant change in that respect?
No, and it wasn't explicitly flagged to me. In fact, I'm not certain I met Susanna Story. I may have done, but I certainly did not meet with her regularly in the way that I met with Will Gibson in terms of the briefings that I was receiving in that period in late 2012 and in 2013. I, of course, was then away for the beginning 6 months of 2014. And so when I came back from maternity leave, Richard Callard was there. And so I presume I got introduced to him in the catch-up days that I had towards the end of my maternity leave when I was getting back up to speed on the different aspects of my portfolio. And, but it will have been in the context of, here's Richard, Will has gone somewhere else, Richard is now briefing on Post Office. I did realise, and I did know that he was on the board. But I think I hadn't made the connection until much more recently in these preparations that actually, yes, that was a very significant change in how that was structured. And it, as I say, it isn't one that was flagged to me. And I think it is one where, as I set out in my witness statement, I think there are real concerns about that role being combined, because it means there is less opportunity for kind of challenge if the other people of the Post Office team are then reporting to him, because he was the most senior person within that specific Post Office team.
Specifically in terms of the non-executive director, the Post Office board member, who did you consider they were accountable to?
Ultimately, to ministers. They would obviously also be a sort of line management responsibility through the senior officials within SHECS, and then ultimately in that way through the permanent secretary of BIS. I believe that as part of BIS, Martin Donnelly as permanent secretary would ultimately have oversight of how SHECS was operating through the chief executive or senior official within SHECS. So there would be both a main line of accountability through the civil service, and then ultimately, obviously, for everything that goes on in the department, ministers have ultimate responsibility.
And how about in respect to the post office?
So, I mean, in terms of the shareholder, could you just...
Yes, in terms of that shareholder, the non-executive director, you've explained that they are accountable to the department. In respect of their accountability to the post office, did you see another line of accountability there?
I mean, obviously that particular individual was a non-executive on that board, and that comes with specific duties as a director as set out in law in terms of oversight of a board. All directors, whether they're in this unusual situation of being a civil servant who's a director on a board of a government-owned body, or indeed any executive or non-executive director would have those roles and responsibilities in terms of that accountability. So yeah, I mean they would have those responsibilities, and I imagine there might be occasions where they would perhaps recognise there would be a conflict. I know sometimes that non-executive director would recuse themselves from a post office decision in those circumstances.
Thank you. I'm going to move on now to early briefings that you received on taking up your post. Could we please start with UKGI 0004195, please? So you've started on the 6th of September. This is the 17th of September. And it is a briefing for your meeting with the Chair and CEO of the Post Office. It begins, purpose, this is your first meeting with Alice Perkins and Paula Vennells. And it sets out there, if we scroll down, your objectives and the purpose. One of your objectives being to understand Alice and Paula's priorities for the business. And what are their objectives? Those are set out as to set out her vision for the business, progress Post Office is making against plan, and any key areas of concern. To underline the importance of new revenue and government work in securing a viable future for the network. Alice and Paula are likely to seek your support in this area. And then if we scroll over the page, we can see the various areas that are likely to come up in your discussion with Alice Perkins and Paula Vennells. Do you recall who drafted this at all?
I mean, I don't recall. I would imagine the first page would often have a named civil servant on it. That would be certainly where I would go to
there isn't. Yes, there isn't on this one.
Oh, in which case I don't know, but I would imagine it would have been the SHECS team. I don't know exactly who it would have been.
Thank you. If we scroll down, we can see the various areas. There isn't an area here that refers to Horizon or complaints from sub-postmasters or anything along those lines. When you started as Postal Affairs Minister, did you have any initial briefing in respect of the allegations that were being made by sub-postmasters? We'll come to a specific email a bit later on, but when you first started? So
this meeting was, I think, in my second week in the role, and I was still at that point having briefings to get up to speed on different aspects of, even, to be honest, even being aware of exactly what different things fell into my portfolio. So, timeshares and the issues of British summertime. And I mean, there was lots of bizarre things that you wouldn't necessarily assume were in the portfolio. So I would often find out what was in my portfolio when I would receive correspondence that I was being asked to answer. So clearly that was in my portfolio. And then I would have these briefings. But by the second week in the role, I had not had all of those briefings. This particular meeting, as an introductory meeting with both Alice and Paula, obviously contained in the annexes that was referenced in that briefing note some background information about Post Office, and therefore this would have been one of the first opportunities for me to really dig into what the priorities were. I obviously knew that, referencing, my own experience as a constituency MP and the wider political context, that the issues around closures and security of the network were clearly going to be significant. But the other issues there, the specifics of government contracts and mutualisation were brought out to me in that note. And in that half-hour meeting, I was able to explore that with Alice and Paula to some extent.
If I could stop you there. That's what's in the note. What's not in the note is any briefing on Horizon.
Yes, and
were you, in those early days, briefed on issues with the Horizon system?
no, not in a sit-down briefing. There was a piece of correspondence which you say we're going to come to, but no, that was not separately briefed to me.
Were you aware that the Post Office prosecuted people?
I don't believe I was at that point. In fact, I think I probably wasn't until the following July when I was preparing for the oral statement in the House.
We've discussed the difference between operational matters and serious or strategically important matters. Where would you see the prosecution of sub-postmasters fit between those two distinctions?
Well, I think in the normal running of the business, of any business, you would expect that if there were concerns about fraud and so on, that would be undertaken and done so through the usual channels. And my assumption would have been, of course, that would have been done by handing information to the police and the Crown Prosecution Service making decisions in the way that would happen for any other business. So the very specific and unusual nature of what the Post Office were doing was not brought to my attention. And indeed, even as late as 2015, I was kind of asking questions to be reassured or to be very clear about the exact nature of that, and was being told that it was the same as any other private individual or institution that could bring prosecutions. So I don't believe that properly reflects how unusual that situation was, but I also don't think I was given that information accurately that explained that situation.
When you started, whose responsibility would it have been to have given you that information?
I think that information should have been given to me by the relevant civil service officials.
And at that time, who would that have been?
There was a team. I think Will Gibson was the head of that team, and there was obviously a number of civil service officials within that team.
Could we please turn now to UKGI 00001458? This is a letter from yourself to another Member of Parliament. If we start on the first page, please. I'm sorry, this is the wrong document. It should be 49, sorry. UKGI 401459. Thank you. A letter to a Member of Parliament, and it says as follows. Thank you for your letter of the 20th of August to Norman Lamb, that's your predecessor, about the independent review by forensic accountants of a number of individual cases raised by former sub-postmasters who raised concerns about the Post Office's Horizon system with their Member of Parliament. I'm replying as this matter now falls within my portfolio. I should first note that Post Office Limited continues to express full confidence in the robustness and integrity of its Horizon system and related accounting processes. Over the past 10 years, many millions of branch reconciliations have been carried out with transactions and balances accurately recorded on Horizon by more than 25,000 different sub-postmasters in total. The next paragraph says, it refers to the Post Office having agreed to an external review, and it says the external review of specific individual cases is being undertaken by a firm of forensic accountants, and to ensure impartiality, James Arbuthnot has reviewed and approved the appointment. I understand that the review process is now underway, and I have asked to be kept informed of developments. So that's the same day as the briefing that has been prepared that doesn't mention Horizon. Can you recall the circumstances in which this was signed, agreed by yourself?
I received a box every evening, and that had a variety of maybe 15, 20 different submissions for me to read, a diary pack, which would have included the briefing notes for the meeting I had the next day, all of the meetings I had the next day. And then also there would be any parliamentary question answers and a stack of correspondence. And so this letter would have been in one of those correspondence folders. I would have reviewed this letter and signed it amongst maybe another 15 or 20 letters. And from the documents I've been shown by the inquiry, which were only recently made available in this perspective, then I asked for a little bit further information on this because I thought it was something which would require more information. I imagine I don't have a memory of the exact what was going through my mind in week 2 of the job with a massive box to be doing that evening, but clearly I asked for a short note on the matter to bring me up to speed.
Can you recall who drafted this letter?
No, and I wouldn't have known who drafted the letter because unlike the submissions that would come to me that would have typically a civil servant name at the top of them, the correspondence would just be in a folder that would have the letter that I had to sign, and often that would be clipped in front of the letter that it was responding to.
Thank you. So we've seen the draft, the briefing to you and the day before you meet the chair and the CEO of the Post Office, which doesn't mention any issues to do with Horizon. We have this letter of the same date. Is it odd that there is no mention of Horizon or of the underlying issues that are referred to here in that briefing for your meeting?
Well, I didn't think it was odd at the time. Obviously, it was a half-hour meeting with the Post Office, and it was the first time I was meeting with the Chief Executive and the Chair. There was already lots to cover in terms of that meeting, and it clearly wouldn't be able to cover every single aspect of everything to do with the Post Office. And obviously, what I was being told in this letter, often the information that you would get as a minister, as I say, you'd find out what was in your portfolio by what letters you were being asked to sign at the beginning of your time as a minister, and you would take the information that had been put down as a letter as useful information for you to be aware of. And this was explaining, obviously, that there was an external review being undertaken, so it looked like there was something being done about an issue that had been raised. It was not clear to me at that point that this was a wide issue in terms of the number of people affected. In fact, it was saying that there was not a large number of people affected, and indeed that there was action being undertaken. So I don't think that would have seemed odd to me at the time.
Was it a topic that was raised by Paula Vennells or Alice Perkins at your meeting the next day, the involvement of Second Sight or complaints by sub-postmasters?
No, it was not.
Could we please turn to UKGI 00001457? I think this is the meeting, the email that you were referring to. It's an email from Mike Whitehead of the 4th of October 2012. If we scroll down, we can see that Mike Whitehead was in the shareholder executive. Was he somebody who regularly briefed you?
Yes, he was. He was part of that team.
He has sent this to, and it's an email address, we'll see if we scroll up, it's an email account that we'll see a number of times today. Swinson MPST, is that your private office?
Yes, that's my private office. It was an email address that went collectively to all of my private secretaries, and then the relevant private secretary who was covering the particular brief would respond to whichever emails were in their brief.
So although it has your name, that doesn't mean it's an email to you personally?
No, indeed, I would not have seen emails to Swinson MPST. I did not have email access until the very end of my time as a minister. Everything was done through paper boxes.
Thank you. And who was Claire?
Claire was one of my private secretaries. At that stage, she was the private secretary who covered post office matters, but also, if I recall rightly, some of the consumer and competition matters, I think. But then later on, she took on the role as the head of my private office after Emily Cloak left.
Thank you. Mr. Whitehead says as follows. He says, at a meeting, recent meeting with Joe, in the context of having signed off the attached PDF reply to John Pugh MP, and that's the letter that we have just looked at, she asked for a short note summarising the position with the Horizon issues referred to in the reply. This is now attached. So it seems as though you've agreed that letter, but have asked for a note to summarise the position. He also says, we are also currently dealing with a Freedom of Information Act request from an investigative journalist relating to our contacts with the Post Office and meetings with briefings for ministers in the context of the integrity and performance of Horizon. And we'll come on to have a look at that as well.
Sure.
The briefing can be found at UKGI 00018-248. Oh, sorry, that's the Freedom of Information one. Could we please first turn to UKGI 000001458? Thank you. So this is the attachment to the email from Mr. Whitehead. I'm just going to read to you a few passages from it. In the second paragraph, about halfway through that second paragraph, it says, since Horizon's introduction, there has been a small trickle of cases referred to ministers from or on behalf of former sub-postmasters who have had their contracts terminated by the Post Office for financial discrepancies or shortages, falling within the range of theft, false accounting or negligence, who have claimed that there are systemic faults with Horizon which have caused the losses rather than theft or of other financial malpractice by themselves or members of their staff/family. Scrolling down, the Post Office has consistently defended Horizon on the basis that the system has been in place for over 10 years. In a typical month, Horizon conducts around 80 million customer sessions with 230 million transactions across the system. This is delivered through around 35,000 counter positions in nearly 12,000 post offices, which perform weekly and monthly accounting balances. Around £175 million per day is settled to over 700 client companies who use the Post Office. A substantial flow of data to and from organisations with regularly audited accounts. Over its extensive period of operation, the system has proved robust. The Post Office cites the cases identified by ex-sub-postmasters where there is some kind of allegation in respect of Horizon as being a minuscule proportion of the many millions of accounting events that sub-postmasters have undertaken since 2000. The Post Office believes that if there were any systematic integrity issues within the system, they would have been evident over the past 10 years. Both the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters and the CWU have expressed full confidence in the system. Just pausing there, do you recall reading this briefing?
No, I don't recall reading it. I'm certain that I will have done, having asked for it, and that looking at it now, I can certainly say that this would have been a reassuring note. It was saying that there was a lot of sub-postmasters, a lot of transactions, lots of big numbers used there, making the case that there was a tiny proportion, minuscule proportion, it says. And then also it explains that there is a process in place to try to resolve it. So it was definitely a reassuring message that was being given, and that it wasn't therefore going to be something that was going to, it seemed to me, require attention. As I say, it's not a memory that I specifically have, but I'm pretty confident from reading it now that will have been how I viewed that note.
And does it reflect conversations that you had at the time?
I mean, I imagine so. I think the other thing that's worth just noting is that this note does not mention prosecutions. So it is in the context of sub-postmaster contracts being terminated, which I appreciate will still have been a massive problem and very distressing for those sub-postmasters, but it also doesn't suggest a criminal prosecution level of this.
It goes on to say, accordingly, the Post Office has consistently and publicly expressed full confidence in the robustness, integrity and accuracy of Horizon, and long resisted periodic calls from former sub-postmasters for an independent review/audit of the integrity of the system. A lobbying campaign group, the Justice for Sub-Postmaster Alliance, was established in 2009 and claims a membership of around 100 members, but details only 14 specific complaints. And then it goes on to talk about potential legal action that was going to be brought. If we scroll down over the page, as you say, there's reference over the page to the Post Office agreeing to commission an independent external review of a small number of individual cases. It was agreed that the review would be conducted by a firm of forensic accountants. And then at the bottom it says, in response to any inquiries to ministers or the department about individual cases being put forward for review, the replies explain that any cases should be referred to James Arbuthnot MP for consideration through their constituency MP. Could we now then move on to the document that I just brought up on screen, which is the submission relating to the Freedom of Information request? That's UKGI 000-18248. So this is from Mr. Whitehead. Was Mr. Whitehead the author of that previous document that we looked at? I know he sent it to you.
I mean, I can't confirm that. I think it's a fair assumption to make, but I can't be certain.
Thank you. If we scroll down, we can see in the summary, it says there's been a Freedom of Information request from an investigative journalist. It covers the department's engagement with Post Office Limited with regards to concerns and criticisms from a number of former sub-postmasters who believe that Post Office's accounting system, Horizon, is responsible for their contracts being terminated by Post Office Limited. The department has always supported Post Office Limited's assertion that the system is robust. It then refers to Second Sight having been appointed, and it says, Post Office Limited is confident that the independent review will support their view that the system is robust and fit for purpose. However, the review has sparked some interest, including this Freedom of Information request. And if we scroll over the page, we can see the request that was made for various copies of documents that pertain to the integrity and performance of the Horizon and Horizon Online system. And if we scroll down to paragraph 9, the proposal is to release 28 items of information, but to withhold 10 items. Can you recall any discussions with Mr. Whitehead about this request?
No, this was a submission in my box alongside many others that evening on whatever day that it came to me that I would have read and responded to with a decision.
Could we please turn to UKGI 000-13747? We're now in November. Before we were on the 23rd of October, so we're now the next month. And this is a letter to another Member of Parliament in respect of their constituent. And again, it starts off by saying, I've noted your constituent's concerns about his experiences as a sub-postmaster, but should explain that Post Office Limited is fully confident about the robustness and integrity of its Horizon system and related accounting process. Since the Horizon system was introduced in 2000, many millions of branch reconciliations have been carried out with transactions and balances accurately recorded on Horizon by more than 25,000 different sub-postmasters in total. I'm also aware of a small number of incidents where sub-postmasters' contracts have been terminated, and in some cases court action has subsequently been taken following the identification of financial discrepancies and shortages. Neither I nor the department are able to comment on or intervene in individual cases concerning operational and contractual matters. And then it sets out inquiries that have been made with the Post Office. And if we scroll down, if we keep on scrolling down, we can see at the bottom of the second page, it says, it is worth noting that sub-postmasters are contractually responsible for all losses occurred. And if we go over the page, it again says, whilst as noted above, sub-postmasters are contractually liable for all losses at their branch. And it ends by saying, should you wish to suggest that Mr. Patel's case can be examined by the forensic accountants, I recommend you contact James Arbuthnot's office to discuss its possible inclusion in the cases being reviewed by forensic accountants. Can you assist us with who would have drafted this response?
I can't tell you a name, but it would have been somebody within that team at Shex would be my assumption, because the way that correspondence worked was that it came in to the department, was processed by the correspondence unit, and they then sent it to the relevant policy team to get a draft response, and it was then sent to my private office for printing and putting in my box.
Would you have discussed it with anybody before agreeing it?
No. Routinely, my correspondence, as I say, would be a stack every evening in my box after doing all of the rest of the submissions in my box, and so the normal process would be that I would scan the letter and sign it. And I think it's important to actually just make that point. Early on in my tenure as minister, I became very unhappy with the standard of correspondence that I was receiving. Frequently, there would be lots of typos, letters that I would have to send back. There'd be sentences that were not finished, and it was actually very stressful because, of course, it was taking me a long time to go through my box, and then that meant I was having to see letters more than once, and so that just expanded the amount of time that had to be spent. And I actually escalated that. A senior civil servant from the Permanent Secretary's office agreed to look at my correspondence for a week before I saw it, and she concluded there was a big correspondence quality problem in the department, and then measures were taken to deal with it. And I remember her saying to me, this is not what you should expect. What you should expect is that you get the letter, you quickly scan it, and you can sign it. So that information had been given to me to recognise that although clearly I needed to be aware and sign the correspondence, that was not something which there would be meetings held about each individual letter, or indeed that it would be something where I would be expected to spend a very long amount of time on each letter, nor indeed would that have been feasible.
Irrespective of the particular individual letter, the correspondence that we've been looking at all carries the same message.
Yes.
Small number of cases, trickle, etc. What kinds of discussions at this point in time were you having within your department about the accuracy of that information?
I mean, as I say, I'd raised general concerns about quality of correspondence. This was not specifically about the Post Office team. That was in general sense to say correspondence is important. It needs to be accurate. I recall taking part in workshops for civil service officials where I, did a little speech about how important correspondence was, because this is people writing to their MP and then writing to a minister, and this is an important part of our democracy, and therefore it isn't something that should be left to the last minute and come to me 3 months after somebody has actually written a letter. So that was in a general sense, that message was going out there. But as I say, in terms of specific cases and specifically in terms of Horizon, at this stage, it was not the subject of particular meetings. When the correspondence came to me, it was clear that there was a process in place with the forensic accountant's second sight, and so it felt to me that that was the appropriate place for these specific issues to be investigated, where the expertise would lie. I clearly wasn't going to be in a situation of being able to pick through the details of individual cases and come to a sensible conclusion about them, nor would that have been appropriate.
If we scroll up onto the first page, it refers to, if we scroll down, sorry, thank you, the final paragraph on that page. It says, I've made inquiries with the Post Office with regards to the particular case. Now, you're not expected to have made personal inquiries, but is it slightly odd that a member of Parliament is conveying what they're told by Post Office Limited, rather than being told to approach Post Office themselves, for example?
So, obviously the I in that sentence is an I, which obviously relates to the wider civil service. And so when I read this to sign it, I take the view that the officials have gone to Post Office. And there's two ways of dealing with a letter like this. You can have what we call our standard lines, where you have some pre-agreed text on an issue, particularly for those kind of postcard campaigns where you get dozens and dozens and dozens of the same issue, where you can just give a pro forma standard line response that's been agreed. But clearly that doesn't feel quite appropriate when you're dealing with individual cases like this. And so I probably would have considered that it was actually helpful to get something that was more of a bespoke response. And to do that, I think the way to do that obviously would have been for them to go to Post Office Limited. There are obviously different ways of doing it. So when I was an MP and I was dealing with constituency correspondence, I would write to agencies, whether it was the Pensions Service or the Department for Work and Pensions, and then close my constituents' correspondence and get an answer from that agency and then send that answer with a covering letter. That would have been another way to do this. But in this case, they obviously were making the inquiries directly, but they've also clearly flagged that they've gone to Post Office to ask about this.
Thank you. Could we please turn to UKGI 00001534, please? I'm being asked if we could slow down in speaking if possible. Thank you. Moving now to the 12th of November, it appears that you visited the Post Office headquarters and had a meeting with Paula Vennells and Kevin Gilliland. And that included, if we see in the first paragraph, a demonstration of Horizon. Is that something that you recall?
I can't say I have a vivid memory of the demonstration of Horizon beyond potentially seeing a computer terminal with some screens. It wouldn't have been... the thing I remember most from that visit, I have to say, is the Post and Go equipment, which was quite new at that point, a little bit like the self-service areas in supermarkets. And so I remember thinking that was quite novel and not being sure how it was going to be received in post offices. But I'm sure I did get to look at a Horizon terminal briefly, and will have seen a screen with different computer options on it. Probably not the most exciting part of the visit.
It's meeting with the CEO. We've seen those letters. We've seen a growing picture of complaints from sub-postmasters, issues with Horizon. Did that come up in conversation at all?
I don't think so. At this stage, there had been some correspondence, but as I've explained, that correspondence is not something which is taking a huge amount of time to deal with. And so the real significance of this issue did not sink in for me at this stage in my ministerial tenure about what was happening with Horizon. I don't think the issue of prosecutions had particularly been raised by this point. For me at this stage, it was definitely in the category of there were some people who had some concerns, Post Office being very robust that those concerns were not well founded, and that there was a forensic process to look into them, which was reassuring.
Thank you. I'm going to move on now to the events leading up to Second Sight's interim report. And can I please take you back to your witness statement and paragraph 21? It's page 8. I'm just going to read from paragraph 21 of your statement. You say as follows, you say, my clear memory of first realising the possible importance of the Horizon issues was a meeting with Paula Vennells and Alice Perkins, in which I was told about the impending publication of the Second Sight interim report. I cannot be certain about the timing, as I do not have access to my ministerial diary, but it would most likely have been in June 2013. I recall the genesis of the meeting being slightly mysterious. It was not in the usual cycle of my regular catch-ups, and unusually, I did not have a briefing note for the meeting in my diary pack for that day. I would not typically meet Paula Vennells and Alice Perkins together. I cannot recall many details of the conversation, but do have a recollection that their tone was quiet and serious as they explained the background to the report. I felt that they were very keen to reassure me that they were taking it seriously, but everything was under control, and I would receive a further update from them shortly. Can you assist us with the description that you've used there, slightly mysterious? What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, normally I would have a diary pack prepared for me for the following day, and it would have each of my meetings set out with a note, information about what to expect, similar to the one which we saw earlier about the meeting that I had, the introductory meeting in the middle of September. And this didn't have that note. So in my mind, I was like, well, what is this about? And it wasn't clear from it being in my diary. Fine, okay. I mean, I did my box that evening, but I was unclear as to what the purpose of this meeting was until I was in the meeting, and that was slightly unusual and therefore slightly mysterious.
You say you didn't have a briefing note. Who would you have expected to have produced a briefing note for that meeting?
So my understanding of the process was that policy officials would produce briefing notes for any meetings within their policy areas. So in this case, it would be the SHECS team. And then my diary secretary, who was part of my private office, would each day collate, a front sheet with actually what my diary looked like, and then all of the different pages in order in one folder that would then be given to me as my diary pack, that as I went about my job during the day, I would take with me and be able to discard each notes for each meeting back to my private secretaries as those meetings concluded. And that would just mean that it would only come to me the night before, so it would be a part of my box, but it would mean that I had, some brief awareness of what was going to be in the meetings. Sometimes, depending on the size of my box, I wouldn't actually get a chance to really read the diary pack in detail until the morning, maybe when I was on my way into the department. But normally, I would have information about the different things in my diary.
So focusing again on that word mysterious, is it surprising for you that your own team didn't provide you with sufficient information before that meeting, or is your concern about the meeting itself?
Well, I think now, within the meeting, it became clear that it was a serious issue and they were being, as I say, very serious about it. I don't know whether it was what they were happy to have committed to paper at that point, whether the officials knew. I don't know exactly how this came to be, but my private secretaries would not have been in a position to be able to give me full details, because they would have been asked for an important meeting. They might have been told a line or two as to why that was important. But I'm sure, had I been in the department when I read that, rather than being given it to go home in my box and I'd asked them, they would have then told me that this is about the Horizon issues. But as I was not physically with my private secretaries when I was reading it, because I was at home, then it wasn't clear to me what it was until I got there.
Thank you. If we scroll down, there's nothing you'd like to add to that paragraph in respect of your recollection of the actual meeting itself, is there?
I obviously remember various conversations in the run-up to the statement in early July. What's hard for me is to distinguish what happened in each of those conversations. So I had some briefings in my office within Parliament, as well as in the department, because on the day of the statement I was in Parliament a lot, and so I had a little kind of cubbyhole type office in Parliament, which was so small that the officials couldn't all fit in and get a seat, so people were kind of sitting on printer tables and somebody was sitting on an upturned bin while I was being briefed on that. But so I have a memory of some of these telephone calls and briefing meetings, but I don't necessarily distinguish what happened in each one of them.
The next paragraph says, I also recall that James Arbuthnot was identified as a key MP coordinating parliamentarians on the issue, and I spoke with him about the issue on the 3rd of July 2013. Following that call, I asked one of my officials, Will Gibson, to follow up on various issues James had raised, one of which was the suggestion that they should speak with Second Sight on my behalf. Just to clarify, what exactly is being said in that final sentence there? Is it that Will Gibson would liaise with Second Sight or somebody else?
Yeah, I think it would be that Will Gibson would do that, and I think there is an email that was sent between Will and possibly Paul that around about that time, I think to Paul following up on that issue. I don't know what the outcome of that was.
So you're not aware whether they in fact met or whether there was an attempt to meet them that was rejected or anything along that?
I don't know. I think it's possible that there was an attempt that was rejected, but I haven't seen the documents to give me confidence on what the outcome was. I don't recall Will coming back to me with outcomes of that meeting, but equally it's possible that they did meet and he used that as part of his information for when he was briefing me on matters.
Thank you. The Second Sight interim report was produced on the 8th of July 2013. At paragraph 23, you've described the run-up to your ministerial statement being rushed or very rushed. Can you expand on that, please?
So, obviously, the Second Sight report, if you see from the document trail, there were lots of emails going back and forth around the Friday the 5th of July and indeed over that weekend. And as explained before, I was not part of that email address. I was receiving my information from the department in paper form. And so I will have gone up to the constituency as usual with my box on the Thursday night, but a lot of things happened after that Thursday night box that I will then not have seen until I was back in the department on the Monday, and then many of those things would have been in the Monday night box. It was a very busy time because I also, on that Tuesday when I made the statement, was doing 2 other debates in Parliament. So I was responding to a debate about consumer protection issues relating to gift cards, people who had been lost money in that issue, and then there was a 1.5-hour debate that I had to respond to on 0 hours contracts and employment protections. So there was a lot going on, and I was therefore receiving the information that had accumulated over the weekend in my box on that Monday night, alongside 2 other debate packs and indeed all of the rest of the correspondence and other submissions that were coming to me as well.
Can we please look at UKGI 401693? It's a note from Peter Batten, who is within the shareholder executive, the 5th of July 2013. He is emailing your private office, and he says, please see attached a short covering note setting out the key narrative and findings of the draft Second Sight report, the Post Office's proposed next steps and handling for its release on Monday, and suggested lines to take. A scanned copy of the report is attached. Would you have received both the briefing and the Second Sight report at that stage?
On the Monday night in my box. I think I received, but I definitely will have received the briefing in that debate pack. I can't be certain that I received the Second Sight report. I might have done. I think it's likely that I probably did, but I can't be as categorical about that. And as I say, it was in amongst a lot of briefing notice, briefing material that I was being given. And it was, you know, as a report goes, there was lines to take given, but it, you know, there was all of the stuff which has been since used ad nauseum by Post Office about there not being any systemic problems with Horizon. But clearly that was, for me, the first time I was reading that, and therefore that seemed reassuring.
Do you recall reading the actual report at that stage?
I'm certain I would not have had time to read the full report at that stage, but I think it is entirely possible that I will have scanned through it. I have a memory of doing so, whether it was at that point or whether it was perhaps after the statement, I can't be certain. But my takeaway from scanning through it was, there was quite a lot that was impenetrable, but there was obviously the summary that I'd received, which seemed to tally up from what I saw.
And let's look at the summary. It's UK GI 00001695. Let's start on paragraph 1.4. The summary is as follows. Second Sight reports that as part of the investigation, the Post Office voluntarily admitted to having identified 2 anomalies that affected 77 branches, 0.65% of the network, and 12 branches, 0.12% of the network, respectively. The report notes that the Post Office took action to rectify these anomalies once they had been identified. On the question of the core Horizon function, Second Sight finds that the system achieves its intended purpose and concludes that they have so far found no evidence of system-wide systemic problems with the Horizon software. Additionally, the report notes that the Horizon system, which involves over 65,000 users, operates smoothly for most sub-postmasters and their staff all of the time. Were you aware at that stage that the finding regarding system-wide problems was only an interim finding?
I think I knew it was an interim report, and that there was, obviously, as transpired, there was further work that Second Sight were undertaking once the working group was set up.
We then have at 1.6, with regard to the wider aspect of operations, Second Sight is more critical, citing the large number of interfaces with linked systems, the complexity of some processes, and the perceived lack of training. Next steps. Though the Post Office see the Second Sight interim report as being unsatisfactory in many respects, their current thinking is to welcome the report and to commit to work with Second Sight's Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance, James Arbuthnot, and other MPs in implementing those changes and improvements. If we scroll over the page, we have then suggested lines to take. The suggested lines to take are as follows. The first is, it's not appropriate for the Department for Business to comment on the details of individual operational business issues for the Post Office, such as those covered in the interim report. However, the department welcomes the interim report's conclusion that there's no evidence of systemic problems with the Horizon system. We see in that first bullet point there, again, the reference to an operational matter. Now, this is an independent report that's been commissioned by the Post Office. We see there that it's being addressed by the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance, James Arbuthnot, members of Parliament. Is it odd that it's still described as an operational matter, or that you can't comment on details of individual operational business issues?
It didn't strike me as odd at the time. Clearly, it was a matter which I needed to understand to the extent that I was making a statement in the House to respond to the concerns being raised by MPs. But the nature of the report was going into quite a lot of detail about issues of training and helplines, which, did strike me as largely operational matters. It felt like the role that we would play as, myself and the civil servants within the business department who were obviously acting as the shareholder was to have confidence that it was being dealt with properly, that the concerns being expressed by MPs were being addressed, and that's why that welcoming of that collaborative approach was certainly from my perspective very genuine, felt like the right thing to do, in speaking with James Arbuthnot, who seemed not entirely happy, but nonetheless very much in a spirit of goodwill to be able to work alongside Post Office. I mean, that seemed to me like the best way to try to address this issue, and that Post Office had recognised that there were some things that they needed to do differently. It did not at this stage strike me as some massive wide issue across the Post Office.
And looking at those suggested lines to take, on reflection, do you agree with those lines?
Well, I mean, having seen the details provided to me by the inquiry, I am staggered that I made my statement to the House of Commons on the 9th of July, and that on the 15th of July, Post Office Limited received the memo, the Clark memo, that said that the credibility of their key witness was fatally undermined. I mean, this to me at the time seemed very reasonable. I cannot quite square in my mind how it was possible for, as the minister, as the shareholder, us to be responding, me to be responding on these issues, being given this briefing, and then that, bombshell. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but when I read that document in the briefing notes, I couldn't believe it. I don't think you do not need to be a lawyer. How could anyone read that document and not realise that this is something which demands urgent attention? And yet, where did that go? We know that Paula Vennells was aware that there was problems with an unsafe witness, and she never told me.
Let's stick now to the chain of events that's happening at this particular time, and let's have a look at an email from Mr. Whitehead on the 8th of July. That's UKGI 00001748. If we could start on page 2. I'll just take you to a couple of documents and then we'll take our first morning break. If we look over the page, please. Mr. Whitehead emails your private secretary following Joe's earlier telephone call with James Arbuthnot, suggested briefing for the Whip's office. Briefing for the Whips on James Arbuthnot tabling an urgent question to obtain a ministerial statement in response to independent review by forensic accountants of Post Office Limited's Horizon computer system, which records all transactions conducted across the entire Post Office network. The issues covered by the review relate to a very small number of ex-sub-postmasters whose contracts were terminated and were subsequently convicted by the courts for false accounting or, in more serious cases, theft and fraud. So just pausing there, by this stage you are aware of the link to criminal prosecutions?
Yes, I was obviously aware of that in the briefing that I was receiving for preparing to give the statement in the House of Commons, which included also briefing on the disclosure requirements that Post Office Limited had to conform to as well. I don't think I had yet entirely understood quite how exceptional the Post Office doing their own prosecutions were, but I was aware that they were prosecuting.
Thank you. Then the next paragraph says, the report confirms that no systemic problems with the Horizon system were found, but also found scope for Post Office Limited to improve aspects of its support and training for sub-postmasters. And if we scroll down towards the bottom of the page, it says James Arbuthnot is seeking to imply that the report suggests that new evidence might be found on the basis of which some false accounting verdicts could be challenged/appealed. What was your understanding of that at that particular stage?
I very little. There was obviously James Arbuthnot was keen to make sure that the case of his constituent could be included in what would be agreed in terms of going forward, the looking at the issues, and ultimately there was agreement that those cases would be included. So I wouldn't profess a strong, detailed understanding, but the issue that there were some sub-postmasters that had experienced convictions that also wanted to be involved in challenging those was something which was brought to my attention in that note.
There's then a further version of the briefing, and that can be found at UKGI 401749. And it looks as though the briefing's been updated. And we can see there's still the reference on the third or fourth paragraph down that the report confirms that no systemic problems with the Horizon system were found. But then if we scroll down, it says, during his conversation with Joe Swinson this morning, James Arbuthnot agreed that the report was better than expected and acknowledged that it did not point to any wide-scale problems with the Horizon system. However, he believes the report provides evidence that some of the convictions of sub-postmasters who plead guilty to false accounting were unsafe, and he would like the government to intervene to offer some form of redress or to reopen these verdicts. We would strongly reject the suggestion that it is the role of either the Post Office or government to intervene to reopen the cases of individual sub-postmasters, as Mr. Arbuthnot appears to suggest. Was that a view that you had, that you shared?
So I think there's two different elements of that sentence, and I strongly agreed with one of those at the time, and I think that's the one that really stuck in my mind at the time, which was that it was not for government to intervene. And I appreciate this is not an easy thing to hear, but it was for those people whose lives have been ruined, but it was something which I did feel very strongly when I stood up in the House of Commons to make a statement, that there is a responsibility for there to be a separation between the judicial process and the government. And it was absolutely right for MPs to be advocating the case of their constituents. It was the type of thing which, you know, I would have done for my constituents too. That was absolutely the right thing for them to be doing. But I felt as a minister, I was in a different position of responsibility vis-a-vis the court process and its independence, and that it would be very dangerous territory to have a minister standing at the dispatch box in the House of Commons second-guessing or throwing doubt on decisions that the courts had made. In this, looking at this sentence now, I can see that the Paul is also included in that, and I think looking at this now, I wouldn't necessarily agree that it was not the role of Paul to intervene to reopen the cases. I think if clearly the disclosure duty is clear that if evidence is found, then Paul should be proactively giving that information to anybody who has been convicted and their defence teams. So I didn't clock that at the time. I did strongly agree with the advice that I was being given about ministers being careful, and that weighed on me quite strongly. I recall in the statement that I wanted to be constructive and helpful, but there was a line that I felt it was important that I didn't cross.
Thank you. So that might be an appropriate moment to take our first morning break.
Yes, by all means, Mr. Blake.
Could we come back at 10 past 11, please?
10 past 11, fine.
Thank you, sir. Can you see and hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Ms. Swinson, I'd like to turn to your witness statement. And we're going to look at page 12, paragraph 25. Thank you. It says, the inquiry has shown me an email chain between Paula Vennells and other Post Office executives dated the 6th to 8th of July, in which Paula Vennells comments that I have also spoken to Joe Swinson again today, who remains supportive about our actions and relatively relaxed about the situation. I cannot recall details of the specific conversation on this date and confidently distinguish it from others I had with Ms. Vennells on these issues. I think it was a telephone call. On another occasion, I recall Ms. Vennells explaining to me in a tone of taking me into her confidence with something of a pained expression that while it was a sad situation, the reality was that some sub-postmasters had their fingers in the till or something to that effect. From the context of the concerns being raised by James Arbuthnot and others by other MPs, I did recognise that there was a real need for the Post Office to deal with and resolve the issues, especially around training and support, etc. Now, it's very important for the inquiry for you to be as specific as you can on this. What is your best recollection of precisely what was said?
Just to be clear, are you asking about the telephone call
The
that Paula Vennells is
second-
commenting on, or the second element that was a different occasion? I'll be really straightforward. I'm not going to be able to give you the exact words that Paula used. It was more than a decade ago, and so what remains in my memory is the impression that it made, not exactly the words that she said. But what she was trying to clearly reassure me, but explain to me, was sort of saying that, you know, although, and as I say, these are not words, these are my impression of what she was saying, that, you know, although these might seem to be lovely people, clearly some of them are actually just at it, is what she was trying to convey. And it was, as I say, that kind of tone of, you know, we have looked into this, and it, you know, and it is very sad, but that is just the reality, and so we have to act. So that's what I recall from that, as I say, with the caveat that I don't know the exact words.
And can you assist us with the timing? Is it in a similar period to the 6th of 8th to 8th of July?
I'm pretty sure it will have been, because this was a point where I had the briefing meeting in June, I think June at some point, without access to the diary. I don't know exactly the date. And then there was clearly telephone calls. I mean, it could have been in that June meeting. I would have been asking questions about this, you know, querying it, because of course, you know, MPs are raising concerns on behalf of their constituents. And so this was Paula Vennells saying to me that, yeah, basically just some of these sub-postmasters are guilty.
What role did that have in the thinking that you had at that time?
So at that time, you know, the related context is around the numbers that I was being told. So, yeah, and all of the briefings were about the millions of transactions, the, you know, not just the 11,500 branch sub-postmasters, but also all of their staff, so the tens of thousands of Horizon users, and that this is a minuscule, tiny proportion. And of course, the figures that I was being told of how many cases at that point, you know, there was, I think, 14 in the in one of the briefings around this point. I think later on, even in 2015, when I asked about which criminal cases remained that would not then be mediated, it was 37. So those numbers were, you know, a smallish proportion of a very large number, and it didn't seem to me to be impossible that there would be some fraud within the post office, but I would have thought it would have been a small amount, and that the numbers that were being given to me seemed to be small amounts. I did ask for specific statistics. I think this was in response to reading the briefing pack, because having seen the emails that my private office sent on the morning of the statement of the 9th of July, I think I asked for, you know, a breakdown of how many of the sub-postmasters had been convicted of fraud or theft or false accounting, how many cases had actually gone to court and the sub-postmaster been found not guilty. I asked for that breakdown as was detailed in that email, but I don't think it was actually provided. And I have to say, one of the things that I regret is that I didn't specifically chase that. I mean, the context of, you know, the number of questions I would ask in any individual ministerial box, we'd be talking dozens, because on each submission I might be making 4 or 5 questions. So, you know, I do recall early on with my private office sort of saying to them, you know, probably in September or October, look, I keep asking you all these questions and responding to things. How are we keeping track of this? Am I supposed to, you know, keep a note of what I've asked? And I remember my private secretary, head of private office, Emily, saying to me, look, you just have to trust us that we follow these things up. That's our job, and you can't possibly know all of it. So I do think I asked for that data, which probably would have been quite instructive to help me understand the context of the balance of the numbers.
I'll take you to that email correspondence shortly. Could we, before we get to that, please turn to FUJ 001744749. This is an internal Fujitsu email. So it's not a document, an email that you will have seen at the time, but it refers to a meeting you had, and I'd just like to see if you recall anything from that. It's FUJ 001744749. Thank you. We can see at the bottom half of that page, please. So it's an email within Fujitsu, and it's referring to a conversation with Paula Vennells. A very good conversation. Headlines are, Paula is very appreciative of our support and recognises how much we have been supporting them. The Post Office account have made a choice not to engage publicly in response to the story, as it hasn't taken off that much. Paula described herself as being mildly troubled by it, which is a change from this being a top priority a week ago. The Post Office account are now looking at what they need to do in response to the report, e.g. increase postmaster training. This is a work in progress for them. And then it's this paragraph. A question is going to be asked in Parliament about the report. Jo Swinson has chosen to answer it personally rather than have a written report because she believes she can kill it more easily by being there in person. Leslie has been over at Parliament this morning, briefing Jo, not sure if Paula was there also. I'm going to break that final one down into two. The first is the reference to you being able to kill it more easily by being there in person.
Well, I mean, Mr. Blake, you showed me this for the first time this morning, and we had a discussion about whether the word that I used on seeing this was appropriate to repeat in the inquiry. Let's just say this is rubbish, because that's probably more appropriate language for the inquiry transcript. I mean, that was not the case. It's wrong on various levels. I mean, the most important being that this was not about killing it, but also it just is. It just doesn't actually make sense because it wasn't my choice ever to be able to give a written answer. So the way that Parliament works, which, as I explained in my statement, was not necessarily well understood even by the BIS Parliamentary office, let alone by, I think this is, you said, an email from Fujitsu. If James Arbuthnot wanted to raise a question in Parliament as an urgent question, that would be up to the Speaker to decide whether or not that should be an urgent question, and that would be answered in person at the dispatch box. And the only choice the government would have would be whether to answer it as an urgent question or potentially, which is what we did, was to preempt that by making a ministerial statement, which in many ways is a bit more respectful to the issue because it is the government coming forward, and also actually was easier from a logistical perspective when I had 3 debates that day to have some degree more of control about the timing, because obviously not turning up for the debate on 0 hours contracts would also have been very disrespectful to Parliament, so that needed to be managed. So it was always going to be answered in person, and this was just the difference about whether we would wait for James Arbuthnot to lay an urgent question or whether we would make a ministerial statement.
In respect of the second part, Leslie's been over at Parliament this morning briefing Jo, not sure if Paula was there. Do you recall meeting Leslie Sewell at Parliament?
I know there were various officials there. I mean, I mentioned my small parliamentary office, and it was a bit crammed, but it was a very small office. There was probably at least 5 or 6 different people in there. I would have known in particular who the ones were from the Shecs team who I was familiar with from being briefed by them regularly. It's entirely feasible, indeed probably likely, that there were 1 or 2 people from Paul there in terms of giving me information to make sure that any questions that I was asking in advance of the statement, to make sure that I knew what answers to give, because I knew that I would be asked lots of questions by MPs. At that point, clearly having a to and fro to post office where we had to send emails was not going to work with the urgency of the situation.
Do you recall if Paula Vennells was there?
I'm pretty sure she wasn't there that day. I do recall speaking to her on the telephone, and so, I probably couldn't be 100% on that, but I don't know, 95% sure she wasn't there on that day.
We have an email from Paula Vennells about what occurred on that day. Could we please have a look at that? That's poll 3099156. Thank you. It's the top email. That's an internal post office email. But she says as follows. She says, I will also send over a summary of Jo Swinson's statement in the House of Commons. She was good and field difficult questions well for us. Now, at that stage, did you consider it your job to be fielding questions on behalf of the Post Office?
When those questions were being posed in Parliament, yes, because there was no alternative. Paula Vennells could not stand up at the dispatch box in the House of Commons, so any questions about the Post Office would need to be fielded by me in the same way that if there was questions about the Competition and Markets Authority or the Equality and Human Rights Commission or any of these other bodies that fell within my portfolio, parliamentary questions needed to be responded to by a minister.
Thank you. Could we turn now to UKGI 401852? And this is, I think, the email chain that you were referring to earlier. If we please turn to page 2. We see at the bottom of page 2 an email from Peter Batten at Shex to Roderick Williams at the Post Office. And that's on the 9th of July at 9:39 in the morning. I left a voicemail about the second sight report. We are likely to have to make a statement to Parliament this lunchtime. Joe Swinson's office has urgently requested information about the number of convictions. Will spoke to you at the end of the meeting on Friday about this, and it would be great if you could send over your findings as soon as possible. We then scroll up on the page, and it sets out the information that you were requesting. How many of the sub-postmasters have had their contracts terminated? How many of the sub-postmasters were convicted of respectively fraud, theft and false accounting? In each category, how many of those convicted pled guilty? How many, if any, were prosecuted but found not guilty? If we scroll over the page, it's to page 1. Susan Crichton responds internally and says, onto it, or in fact, still to the same chain. She responds to Will Gibson and says, Will, we're working on this. We'll get through to you as soon as possible. That's the 9th of July. We're now at 10:36. There's then an email on the 16th of July, so a considerable time after, from Peter Batten at Shex. And he says, did Susan, Roderick or Martin ever come back to either of you on this? I know Pol often drop me off their copy lists. I try not to take it personally. And if we scroll up the page, a response from Mr. Whitehead says, sadly, they have a habit of dropping everybody off when we seek awkward data. I have not seen anything, and my guess is that without a chaser, they'll unilaterally decide we don't need it. Can you explain your understanding at that particular time of difficulties getting information from the Post Office?
It's not something I was aware of. This issue that Mike is expressing in the email, which I think does speak volumes, given what we know now, was not something that was brought to my attention at the time. And as I said, I did rely on my private office and my officials to chase the many questions that I asked. But I do think this is pretty shocking. And I think it's on two levels. I mean, just on one level that, I was answering questions in Parliament and needed information and, needed it to be able to give good answers to the people who were asking me questions, who, let's remember, are speaking there on behalf of their constituents who have been affected by these issues, right? So that, that has an importance attached to it. So if I'm asking for that information, it should be provided in a timely way. And it certainly shouldn't be something that needs to be chased. But then it's also problematic because if this is the experience that Shex are having, that I think points to potential deeper problems with what Post Office is willing to provide, and that would raise some alarm bells, but it's not something that was raised with me at the time.
In terms of timing, the 8th of August was then the first meeting of the working group. And I'd like now to take you to September, and can we look at poll 00196410? And could we please turn to page 4? There's an email, if we scroll down, from Alan Bates to a number of people, Paula Vennells, Susan Crichton, Angela van der Bogard. You were copied in Swinson MP Correspondence, so is that your constituency email account?
No, MPST Correspondence. So like the Swinson MPST address was my private office, this would be the Correspondence office for my portfolio.
Thank Thank you. This is correspondence that the inquiry has seen a number of times regarding Mr. Griffiths. This afternoon I received the following email. It's a prime example of the thuggery being exerted on the defenceless sub-postmasters. If we scroll up, we can see on page 3 at the bottom of page 3, Stephen Mosley, MP, says that he will forward it to yourself. And if we keep on scrolling up, Mr. Bates responds, and he says, I did send a copy of the email to Jo Swinson, who I've been in contact with over sub-postmaster issues since she was appointed. I've also met with her 2 predecessors. And then if we go to page 1, we have Mr. Mosley's letter to you, which says, Dear Joe, please find attached a copy of correspondence recently received from Mr. Alan Bates regarding his concerns relating to the suicide attempt of my constituent, Mr. Martin Griffiths, sub-postmaster. I think you've said in your statement you don't recall this correspondence. Is that correct?
I don't recall seeing it, and I'm very sorry about that, and it's clearly describing incredibly tragic events.
Who would have been responsible for bringing this to your attention?
Well, in the normal course of events, correspondence would come to me through the correspondence office in my stack of nightly correspondence. And so that would be the normal way in which correspondence would make its way to me. In some cases, and I think this is one that would certainly qualify, there would be an argument for raising it maybe in a submission and bringing it to my attention in a way that was more significant than one letter among many in correspondence.
So is it your evidence it's likely that you would have received it in a pack because it's correspondence from a fellow parliamentarian?
I mean, I think that is likely, but I do not recall it. And of course, the content is such that I think my instinct is that it's the kind of thing that you would recall. But I'm sorry, I can't give any more detail than that because I don't have a memory of receiving it.
Thank you. And that can come down. Thank you. Now, in terms of timing, the 18th of December 2013 to the 30th of June 2014 was your period of maternity leave. As we discussed earlier, in the meantime, Mr. Callard became the head of the Post Office shareholder team in January 2014, and he became the non-executive director on the Post Office board in March 2014. Had you met Mr. Callard at all before your maternity leave?
No, not to my knowledge. I suppose it's possible I could have been introduced to him just as I was leaving if it had already been confirmed he was taking over from Will, but I think it's unlikely.
Could we please turn to UKGI 000-42677? This is a shareholder executive presentation from February 2014, so you would have been on maternity leave at the time of this presentation. It's a presentation the inquiry has seen before. If we could turn to page 6, please. It says on the left-hand side there is a general feeling that Paula is not the optimal person to lead the Post Office to deliver its commercial strategy. Paula has not been able to establish good working relationships with Jo Swinson. She has been unable to retain key staff. Just pausing there, was that an accurate reflection of your relationship?
I don't think it was. I'm not going to say there were never any frustrations with the Post Office. I was asking for more information on the speed of network transformation to make sure that the future of the network would be secure. But I engaged with Paula regularly, and I felt we did have quite a good working relationship. So I don't really know where that particular sentence has come from, and it was a big surprise to me when I saw it come forward in the pack, and indeed when it was I think put to Alice Perkins.
Performance as CEO and delivery of strategic plan. The Post Office failed to deliver its 2010 strategic plan. She has shown a worrying lack of knowledge about the detail of the new plan. Paula's people management has caused concern as she appears unable to work with personalities and approaches that differ from hers, and has failed to build relationships with key directors. Paula's performance as CEO has been questioned by the Post Office Chair and by members of the board. Engagement with ministers and stakeholders, Paula has not developed strong relationships with stakeholders. The scale of change envisaged under the strategic plan requires a visible, dynamic and charismatic leader able to re-engage and energise the relationship with stakeholders. This includes engaging with biz ministers. Over the last year, Paula has repeatedly overpromised and under-delivered. So you've said in your statement that this wasn't something that you were aware of.
No, I mean, this is quite a shocking document to see, right? When you talk about what might be operational matters and what might be strategic matters, I recognise, and I know this inquiry has interrogated that distinction, and sometimes there might be a degree of grey area, whether it is something operational or strategic. But is the chief executive fit to do the job? Really pretty clearly strategic, right? Right up there with something that is strategic. And therefore, I just can't understand how, the department of which I was a minister has a slide deck which is talking about the removal of the chief executive of Post Office Limited without actually talking to ministers about that. I mean, it just stuns me that can be happening. I appreciate, as I think Richard Callard said later, there's an issue about at what stage you might raise concerns with ministers, and it probably wouldn't be the first time you had an inkling that there might be an issue. But at the point at which you're creating a whole, PowerPoint deck about it, clearly the time has come that ministers need to be engaged in this discussion. And I would argue not actually just the person who was in my role as the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State, but this is something which at the Secretary of State level should have been discussed. So I'm pretty shocked. And obviously I was on maternity leave, so I wouldn't have expected personally to know this at this point. And just for context, about a few weeks, November 13, a few weeks before I went off maternity leave, I received a submission about Paula Vennells' remuneration, advising me that we wish to retain her as a director and we don't think any downward pressure on pay is appropriate at this point. So just a matter of weeks after that, we've got to this situation. I think that feels very strange. And although I wouldn't have expected to know about this at the time because I was on maternity leave, Jenny Willett, who was covering for me, should have been appraised, as should Vince Cable.
And let's move on to when you're going to be returning. Can we please look at UKGI 0002288, please? Maybe 4 zeros. If we look at the bottom email, thank you. Dear all, an update on some plans in train to support Jo Swinson's return from maternity leave. We expect Jo to return to the Department for Business, GEO, around the end of June, but we'll confirm once definitive. Jenny will continue as Minister, taking all decisions until Jo's return. Briefing Jo. We are starting to brief Jo more regularly on some of the developments since her maternity leave. We'll begin this in May through catch-ups between Jo and Jenny, as well as with private office. We then propose to do some high-level, 1-hour briefing sessions between Jo and each of her main directorates in early June, and one of those being Post Office. If we scroll up, please, there's an email from Mr. Callard to Peter Batten. He says as follows, see below, please can you start putting some thought into this? Clearly we'll have our priorities to discuss, but you will have a better idea of what her priorities might be then than I will. As we will have to address those as well, we might want to also think about how many sessions we might need, e.g. I want to get her in the right place on Sparrow. Looking back at those early briefings, what do you understand that to have meant? I know it's not you that's writing it, but if you reflect on the briefing that you did ultimately receive.
I mean, I think the contrast is very illustrative here. So we've got an email where Richard Callard is saying, I want to get her in the right place on Sparrow. And I didn't know what Sparrow was, but obviously do now. And if you contrast that with the note that I actually received when coming back from maternity leave about Post Office Limited, there is, I think, one sentence on Horizon, which is incredibly bland. It is buried in a paragraph called, exceptional items. It isn't even highlighted as a risk. And it basically says that the working group is set up, progress is a bit slower than we would hoped, and Post Office is seeking assurance on its position. And, that's a very kind of nothing to see here sort of sentence. And so I just think that's a really interesting contrast, right? That he was not actually giving me information about what was happening in Sparrow. And we know he wasn't, because now when we look at the minutes of the Sparrow meetings, it's actually the opposite of what I was being told. So the Sparrow meetings were talking about reducing the role of second sight, which was never mentioned to me, even in the final conversations that we had nearly a year later about the closure of the working group, right? It was never mentioned in any of the subsequent points when, knowing that second sight were important to me, when I came back from maternity leave, when I was asking questions about Horizon in September, when I was preparing for the Westminster Hall debate. I mean, if a civil servant knew that second sight's investigation was important to me and that Post Office were thinking of reducing their role, I mean, that's something he should have been warning me about that was a problem rather than hiding from me. And then we had what they were planning to do with the working group, again, looking at the Sparrow minutes from that time, around about this April 2014 period, where they were basically saying that they were going to reinterpret how they engaged with the mediation scheme within the existing terms of reference. And I mean, in a sense, when you see that, it's no wonder that trust broke down and that all ground to a halt later that year. But when that trust was breaking down, I was being briefed by them that this was because other people were trying to extend the scope of the scheme. I mean, it's Orwellian, frankly. They were saying, themselves that they were basically going to change the way they engage with the scheme, and then told me that other people were reinterpreting it or extending the scope. So, I mean, to me, I just cannot, I cannot understand how a civil servant could operate in that way. And I just want to say, because I obviously have in my witness statement been critical of Richard Callard, it is totally not the experience that I had dealing with dozens of civil servants across so many different areas of my brief. My general experience of dealing with civil servants was that they were diligent, they were thoughtful, they were respectful of Parliament, they cared about the issues and how they affected members of the public.
Dealing with this particular individual.
And this was totally contrary to that.
Thank you. Could we please turn to UKGI 00002439, please? We're now in August 2014. 6 months have passed since that presentation regarding the performance of Ms. Vennells. It's an email from Mr. Callard to your private office. He says, Claire, thanks for the discussion today, very helpful. I have attached the note that I mentioned. Alice saw the first iteration. I've just sent this second iteration to her and thought it might be expedient that you see it sooner rather than later. I would be grateful if you could flag any potential red rags in here. Just to be clear, this is not a speaking note as such. It's too long for that. It's something just to get thoughts in some sort of order, but it gives you the general gist of our arguments. If you do have a word with Joe prior to the meeting, I would be grateful for any readout if you get chance. So this seems to be a document that has been seen by Alice Perkins at the Post Office, and it's not a speaking note, but it is some thoughts. We'll come and look at the content, but what is your general view of the appropriateness of that being sent to your private office for their comments before being seen or being discussed with you?
So just to put this in context, this is about the issue of the remuneration of a potential new chief finance officer and an amount of money that then would need to be paid to the existing chief finance officer to encourage his exit. And I referred just now to a submission that I received in November 2013, which said we wish to retain Paula Vennells. It also said we wish to retain Chris Day as the Chief Finance Officer, and we don't want any downward pressure on their remuneration at this time because they're both in place and doing well. And that was just before I went on maternity leave, and then literally days after I returned from maternity leave, having had the kind of briefing meetings where I was brought back up to speed and no concerns raised about the performance of the senior executives of the Post Office beyond a note in the briefing that said that they'd made some changes around HR and so on. I then received this note that says, we would like you to write to Danny Alexander to ask for exceptional permission to appoint a new Chief Finance Officer for Post Office Limited on a salary which was more than £500,000, and also to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds on an exit payment for the existing Chief Finance Officer, to which I, perhaps quite understandably, was rather shocked because I'd never heard of a suggestion that we needed to replace the Chief Finance Officer and thought that that would have been something that perhaps I should have known about if that was the case, before the point at which they were asking me to approach Danny Alexander, who was the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, for permission. And the permission would have been needed because the sums involved were of a level that needed approval because they were exceptional in terms of the levels of pay. And in the context, of course, at this time, with incredibly difficult financial circumstances, government making all sorts of really heart-rending decisions about budgets. So my instinct was, if I'm going to ask Danny Alexander for money, it's probably not going to be for hundreds of thousands of pounds for post office executives when you've just told me the current Chief Finance Officer is doing a perfectly good job.
So if I could just pause you there. We're both going to get in trouble with the stenographer.
Okay.
Could I ask you to ideally keep your answers relatively short
Okay.
And relatively slow if possible?
So that was the context, and I then I had some back and forth when I responded to that submission, and I said, no, I'm not happy to send this letter to Danny Alexander, and there was pushback, and I think there were some meetings with officials. I think that this was in advance of a call that Alice Perkins was planning to have with me that Friday.
Shall we look at the document itself?
Yeah.
Let's look at it. It's UKGI 00002440. So this is the attachment to the email. I think your evidence is that you didn't see this attachment.
No.
It, in fact, wasn't intended to be seen by you. It was your understanding.
That's right. And indeed, they were asking my private office to sort of give them a bit of intelligence about whether this would be a red rag, presumably meaning to a bull. And given that it was the government's policy to have pay restraint in difficult financial circumstances, reading this now it's very shocking that, that this is what they were trying to do, and indeed that they hadn't been straightforward in the note that they clearly sent me in July about why they wanted a new Chief Finance Officer.
So let's have a read. It says, as you know, Shecs and the board are clear the current CFO is not the right person to take the company forward given the challenges it faces. If we skip down, it says, all that, and on reflection, we should have approached you earlier. However, we want to explain to you why we need to come and see you on this and why Alice and the chair of the Remco want to meet you and Vince. The difficulties on the CFO front have brought forward the concerns the board and Shecs has about the CEO, which you need to be aware of and which puts the appointment of a new CFO in a wider context. The board's concern over the performance of the CEO has been growing for some time and has only recently got to the point where it feels it needs to act in due course. But this leaves the board in a difficult place. Removing a CEO without a confident CFO capable of holding the fort is a big risk. This makes replacing the CFO all the more important, which explains the board's heightened concerns and why Alice wants to talk to you and Vince in person. So very briefly, just to summarise, the proposal is a new CFO because we want to replace the CEO, and we can't do that until we have a good CFO in place. Is that correct?
Yes, and that is not what I was told, but that's what this note is arguing. And this is clearly after a period of time where they have done a full recruitment process. So this is clearly at the end of probably at least 2 to 3 months of them taking action on this in terms of recruiting headhunters to be able to search the field, conducting interviews, going through all of those steps while not briefing me on it, and even then not telling me that they had these concerns.
And then if we scroll down, he seems to posit a question: why haven't you told me about the CEO before? Why didn't it form part of the CFO advice? And the bullet points there say, removing the CEO is a very dangerous and destabilising thing to do. It's not something the board takes lightly, so it needed to be certain before coming to you. We are also conscious that the moment we tell you about Paula, your relationship with her is irrevocably changed. The board has been monitoring the situation for some time, but until recently have felt that the balance of risk pointed towards keeping Paula in place, given the uncertainty and difficulty of appointing a successor. There are a number of reasons why the balance has now changed. Efforts to improve her performance has failed. The board is increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress. Reference there to specific business areas like Horizon and the strategy in general. This crystallised for the board at the June away day, where Paula very much sat back and let her team lead. She acts more like a non-executive director than someone who leads from the front. If we go over the page, please. There's a section there on what is wrong with the CEO. And then we see there, for example, issues like the Horizon mediation scheme and financial services have required significantly more oversight by the board than one might expect, as things haven't been gripped. And then there's a section on why a new CEO would require higher remuneration. And then what have you done to put measures in place to improve her performance? Alice has spent an enormous amount of time coaching, mentoring and monitoring Paula. Important to note that Alice has significant non-executive director experience, huge amount of experience in knowing what she can and can't be done with both Paula and Chris. Paula responded to initial efforts to improve performance, but this has levelled off and is ultimately about character and aptitude. Mr. Callard's evidence to this inquiry was that he probably presented his case to you in accordance with this note. Is that your recollection?
Absolutely not. And it's something which I think I would have recalled, because one point I would agree with from that note is that it's the kind of information that would irrevocably change my relationship with Paula and the way in which I interpreted what she was telling me and the assurances that she was giving me. And that, I obviously did engage with Paula on a regular basis, and the assurances that she gave me, personal assurances as well as in writing on Horizon, actually were very important. They were not received with the knowledge that she was somebody who lacked grip and pace on the issue of Horizon. And if this was the view of the biz civil servants, arguably, probably fairly given what we now know, then it also, I think, raises questions about how they were probing the information that they were getting from Post Office Limited about Horizon in general terms, if they felt that that had not been properly gripped. But these concerns were not put to me. I don't know exactly the chronology of what happened. I do recall having a meeting, but I think it may have been in July, shortly after the submission. Ultimately, I was not happy to approve the extra money, but I do know that it went to the Secretary of State, Vince Cable, who ultimately did write the letter to the Treasury. So I don't know the chronology of what conversations were then had with Vince.
Could we please turn to UKGI 00002472? We're moving on a few weeks later now, and there's a briefing for you on Second Sight's Thematic report, which has been leaked. I'll just read to you a few paragraphs from that. A report leaked yesterday. It's critical of the Post Office's Horizon accounting system. In italics below that, it says, it's important to stress that despite over a year's worth of investigation by the Post Office and independent investigators Second Sight, no systemic or technical deficiencies have been found with the Horizon system. If we scroll down, the same form of words is in bold there. And it says, and the flavour of the report reflects the Post Office's general concern that Second Sight has not been as objective or forensic as they might otherwise have been given their role. And it sets out further detail. The mediation scheme has been a significant concern for the Post Office for some time. Whilst no substantial issues with the Horizon system have been found, their concerns include the following. They consider that independent investigators Second Sight have gone native and are unduly taking the side of the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance. This is supported by the fact that Second Sight have admitted privately that they find it emotionally difficult to opine against sub-postmasters, regardless of the circumstances. Second, claims in the Thematic report and the individual reports on each case prepared by Second Sight have generally been unsubstantiated. For example, Second Sight's claim that power loss can lead to data loss for the sub-postmaster, creating discrepancies between cash accounted for in Horizon and cash in the safe or till. There is no evidence to support these claims. Second Sight do not sufficiently acknowledge that the relationship between the Post Office and sub-postmaster is one of principal and contractor. And in the final bullet point on that page, a number of the reports written by Second Sight in relation to individual cases have been rejected by Tony Hooper on the basis that the claims are unsubstantiated. In such cases, he has tasked Second Sight with rewriting the report. It's not clear why he has not treated this report similarly. If we go over the page, please. Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance has had difficulty in accepting that some cases will not warrant mediation because the SPM was clearly at fault or was victim of fraud by their own staff. Second Sight has continued to widen the scope of the investigation rather than focus on the Horizon system, prolonging the investigations and increasing costs. Meanwhile, whilst the mediation scheme continues, expectations around possible compensation have grown to potentially unrealistic levels. We'll see that this was sent by Mr. Callard. Perhaps we could turn to UKGI 00007352. And if we start on page 2, this is from your private office to Mr. Callard, and it says, the Minister was grateful for this briefing and commented that she found it very useful. I'd like to add my thanks for the quick turnaround. She had one question with regards to the following paragraph. A small number of the reports written by Second Sight in relation to individual cases have been rejected by Tony Hooper, and that's the passage I just took you to. Should like to know if we can ask him for more details, and wondered if the fact that he hadn't asked the reports to be rewritten meant that he found the report credible. Should be keen for further clarification on this. She commented that she found it difficult to just accept the Post Office's analysis of the report without evidence. For the future, please keep Private Office copied in on any newsworthy developments. I think we were fairly lucky that this story didn't gain much traction and Jo wasn't asked to comment. It's really important that we are aware of these kinds of events so that Jo feels prepared and cited on issues within her portfolio. So we've highlighted two paragraphs there. Let's start with the first of those paragraphs. Can you assist us with what your concern was?
I mean, this is one of the submissions where I really so wish that my handwritten notes had been preserved, because reading between the lines of the private office email, I was not best pleased to see this particular thing. I mean, obviously, we've got the nice diplomatic private office bit at the beginning saying it was very useful, but here's the real question, and you've got to keep us informed in future. So, you know, there was that paragraph about the reports. I'd previously been told that Second Sight's reports' quality had been questioned by Sir Anthony Hooper. And clearly, I think that was intended to you know, reduce my view of Second Sight's credibility. But I obviously was picking up on the fact that he hadn't made any kind of rejection of this report, and therefore that might suggest that he found it credible. And I thought he was a particularly important person to listen to on this matter, because he was somebody who had a great you know, career as a Court of Appeal judge, and as somebody who would be able to be objective and also used to dealing with events and cases that were complex, where different issues were being put forward. So I was being very questioning about that matter. I would be keen, if it's possible, to just point to one other thing in that briefing note, which at the time, you know, if anything, I probably found reassuring, but with the benefit of the subsequent information I've seen by the inquiry, is deeply troubling to me, which was the point on the previous page that sets out some of the cases that had been settled and mediated. So that was in the note itself.
Shall we go back? Would you like me to
Yes,
take
that would be really helpful.
So that's UKGI 402472.
And it was on the second page. So this paragraph that starts in those cases that have been mediated or settled, Paul considers it should have conducted itself better operationally. But it is important to stress that these are not system related. I think I would have taken some comfort from that fact, that the mediation scheme was, you know, finding that there were issues, but they were not systemic or showing wider problems. But when I look at the Sparrow minutes from April, where it is minuted that they should accelerate the specific cases that are not thematic because it might be useful to show the minister. I mean, I consider that that is, you know, a premeditated manipulation of the working group process, specifically designed to reassure me that there isn't a problem by presenting cases which are not representative. As one imagine in anything like this, there might be some simpler cases, by presenting those as representative of the vast number of sub-postmaster cases. And I mean, to me, that just feels duplicitous to actually set out to prioritise those cases so that they can then pretend to me that those are representative. And I mean, there maybe was a case for, you know, making the simple cases go first to build everyone's confidence in the scheme and, you know, get some cases done. But to show them to me as if they're representative, as has been presented in this note, I mean, as I say, again, it just feels to me the opposite of what civil servants should be doing and the opposite of what my general experience was of dealing with civil servants.
Thank you. If we turn back to the email chain, then that's UKGI 407352. And I'm going to ask you about the second of those bullet points that we looked at. Sorry, the second of the highlights that we looked at. So it's page 2 at the bottom of that email. So for the future, please keep private office copied in. And was there a concern at that stage about the level of information that you were being given?
Yes, I think that the genesis of this note and the reason why my private office is thanking them for the quick turnaround was that it was one that didn't come from them to us, as would often be the case, and indeed as from the earlier letters I signed that I would be regularly updated on progress with the scheme, we would have anticipated. But instead, I think this was in response to some media reports of the leak of the part 2 of the second site report that went to the working group members. And so, in response to that, myself or my private office have then asked for a note. So, yeah, that did raise a concern, and very firmly officials were being told by my private office that they needed to be more on it in terms of making sure that I was abreast of what was going on.
Thank you. If we turn to the response from Mr. Batten on the first page from the shareholder executive, he addresses the point about why hasn't Sir Anthony Hooper rejected this. He distinguishes between what were the case reports and what is the second site thematic report. If we scroll down, it says as follows. It says, the report that Richard's email referred to has become known as the thematic report, and the intention had been that it was produced as a generic reference document for use during the mediation process. To be clear, although the working group can recommend a case for mediation, it plays no role in that mediation, which is between the applicant and the post office as the two involved parties. There is no role for Tony Hooper in the mediation process either. SHEC's officials understand that the mediation process does not involve the working group. Tony Hooper has taken the view that the thematic report is outside of his remit. The fact that he didn't ask for the thematic report to be rewritten does not suggest that he found it credible. Given the high number of objections that the Post Office has flagged about Second Sight's thematic report, it is perhaps unlikely that any report will satisfy all parties. And then it's the final sentence there. It is not, at this point in time, appropriate to ask Tony Hooper for more details about his view on a report that is still confidential from the perspective of the working group. Were you told this at the time?
I'm sure this will have been relayed to me, not necessarily with this full email, but possibly in a cover note from my private office. And I think obviously there was a confidentiality issue. I could appreciate that, but I had thought it would be very helpful at this point to get the views of Sir Anthony Hooper because of his objective and independent position. Clearly, there was strong pushback against that at this point from SHECs.
And you describe it as pushback, looking at that final sentence, to be told that it's not appropriate to ask Sir Anthony Hooper for more details. Would you have understand that formulation of words to have itself been appropriate?
I think in a normal scheme of business, then that would not usually be used. But I think the difference with the mediation scheme is that you're dealing with, a very formal process. The CEDR have guidelines about how it operates. It therefore was something which was not familiar to me, and I could totally appreciate that there might be some boundaries about at what point you would, it would be appropriate to speak to, the former Court of Appeal judge. I mean, I would note I did ask to meet Sir Anthony Hooper a couple of months after this particular point, and he declined to meet with me. And in a sense, that decision that he made rather reinforced the point that I was being told about what was appropriate and where that ministerial intervention could be, to what extent that was possible. I obviously put a lot of store in Sir Anthony Hooper's view of what was appropriate as somebody very esteemed with a lot of experience to be able to navigate those boundaries.
Thank you. Sir, that might be an appropriate moment to take our second morning break.
Certainly.
Could we come back just after 15:15 to, should we say, 17?
Yeah, by all means.
Past.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. I'm going to now turn to preparation for the Westminster Hall debate. Could we start with UK GI 402764? Thank you. This is a briefing that has been prepared, and we'll come on to a question that you ask about this briefing. One of the questions that is put forward there, sorry, it's zoomed out on my screen. I don't know if it has on yours as well.
Yes, it has. My eyesight's not quite that good.
I haven't got it on screen at all, Mr. Blake.
It's just coming, sir. Thank you.
Fine.
So the second of those questions, if we scroll down, please. If it's not a horizon issue that is causing the problem, what is? 140 sub-postmasters can't be wrong. The proposed responses are 140 sub-postmasters is less than 0.03% of the total users of Horizon. There are thousands of other sub-postmasters who have not made a complaint. Reference there to investigations so far show that a large number of the problems were caused by how the sub-postmasters themselves were using Horizon. Over the page, please, if we scroll down to the second of those questions, there's a further question. Why did Post Office agree to incorporate convicted cases into the scheme if it knew it wasn't going to mediate? And one of the proposed answers there, bullet point 4, Post Office is, however, under an absolute duty to immediately disclose any information which might undermine the prosecution's case or support the case of the defendant, and the Post Office has done so where appropriate. There is no doubt in my mind that it is being particularly vigilant in this regard as it carries out its investigations. If I could now take you to the covering email, that's UKGI 0000916. Thank you. It's an email from your private office to Mr. Callard. And it says, "Hi, Richard. To be aware, ahead of this morning's briefing session, I put the submission, speech, question and answer, that's the question, I think that's the question and answer document we've just seen.
Yes, it is.
And Hooper letter to Jo overnight, and she had some comments/questions. And if we look at the Q&A, the question that's highlighted is one of those that I've just taken you to, which is why did Post Office agree to incorporate convicted cases? And it's the reference there to the disclosure duty. And it says as follows, it says, Jo feels like she needs a bit of clarity on this element of the legal process, another one to chat about today. Can you assist us? Did you get that clarity?
Yes, I definitely got more clarity. I think I now have severe questions about the accuracy of that. But I felt when I read this Q&A document that the phrase, "there is no doubt in my mind that it is being particularly vigilant in this regard," was a strong phrase. And it was, therefore, it stood out to me as potentially reassuring. But I felt that, in order to have confidence in that phrase, as I was being encouraged to say this, because the Q&A document, just so that people can understand, is in a Westminster Hall debate that is an hour and a half long, you don't know exactly what's going to come up, and you have to respond to all of the issues, or as many as you possibly can, that are raised in the debate. And so the Q&A is to help you be able to then have your answers ready to be able to, if you like, pick and mix from the different questions that come up. In addition to any speaking notes. And so it was drafted with a view that I would be able to say those words. And I felt that if I was potentially going to say those words, I needed to have a little bit more confidence in particularly vigilant. On a basic level, that the Post Office Limited had this legal duty to immediately disclose information and was complying with that duty felt uncontroversial, because that's what you would expect of any institution or public body, that they would comply with their legal duties, but particularly vigilant. I thought, well, that's good, but what is this particular vigilance? Now, I had a face-to-face briefing, as would be common with any of these debate preparations, where I would sit down with officials in advance of the debate, and that was having read the debate pack, and then rather than going through everything, we could just focus on the parts that I felt I needed to understand better. And this was one of those.
Just pausing you there. Who was that meeting with?
Definitely would have included Richard Callard. I think it's likely it would have also included one or two other officials from that team. I don't think anybody from Post Office Limited would have been there. That wouldn't have been my expectation, but I can't be categorical on that part.
And what was said in relation to that passage that you had concerns about?
My memory is of being reassured. Now, I cannot tell you exactly which words were used, but I know obviously that there had been the Altman review, so I think it is likely that I was reassured by being told that a QC had examined the cases and looked at them, and there also had been, although I don't think I was briefed about it specifically, the Deloitte review. So my memory is of being reassured that independent reviews had been done that sounded very impressive and thorough and comprehensive. While I can't recall exactly which words were used, I expect that those would have been the ones that had been referred to, if not by name, then in description of what they had done.
Thank you. Could we please now turn to UKGI 0002837 and start at the bottom of the first page and into the second page. We have an email here from your private office to Mr. Callard, 16th of December, and it says, so James, I think that's James Arbuthnot, no longer plans to share his speech with us ahead of time. Apparently it's very inflammatory and he's worried about putting in an email. And it says, him and Joe had a quick catch-up in which he outlined his main asks. I understand you've got a packed day tomorrow, but grateful if you could ask the Post Office about some of those, as Jo will need to respond in her speech, and would be good to know how warm she should be to those asks. We see there, for example, number 4 is he'd like Second Sight to do a briefing for members of Parliament on the scheme and its progress. Jo would like to commit to asking Tony Hooper about this. What do you think? Number 5, he would like us to ask the Post Office to stop acting as a prosecutor on these cases. If we turn to page 1, we have a response from Mr. Callard. Not surprising, re-decision not to share the speech. Just looking at the distribution list, at this stage we have Belinda Crowe and Patrick Burke, both from the Post Office, copied into this distribution list. And he says, for example, at number 4, Second Sight probably need permission from the working group. They've gone native, but I think Jo could possibly commit to asking Tony about it at the risk of putting Tony in a difficult place. Belinda/Patrick, could we have a view and a line, please? Number 5, pass over to Pol. I know they are or were a prosecuting authority, but if there has been a theft or fraud and it is in the public interest, they have no real choice. Otherwise, what's the deterrent? Anyone could put theft down to the system. Belinda, could you do a line, please? Is it odd that 2 employees of the Post Office are in this distribution list and asked to comment within a distribution list that includes a minister's private office?
I think in the first line there, it says, copy Belinda and Patrick for expediency. So I suspect that, I do think it's slightly unusual. I think the thinking, it looks like, was the debate is on the Wednesday the 17th. This is the Tuesday morning. Therefore, there's some quick turnaround required, and so it's for that reason. So I'm less looking at that now. I'm less, appalled about that particular aspect than accepting what Pol say without question, particularly in the context of what we know was being said about whether or not there was grip on the Horizon issue at the senior levels within Pol. So, asking Pol for their view, on some issues where they might only have the information, maybe this isn't the best way for it to be done, but the really important thing should be civil servants, probing and, making themselves confident that they have all of the information that they need and that they are doing so with a a degree of critical assessment of analysis of what they're being told.
And does this email reflect that?
No, I think this reflects a very cosy relationship.
Thank you. The Westminster Hall debate was on the 17th of December, so the day after this email. We don't need to go into what was said at the debate, but do you think that you were appropriately briefed for that debate?
At the time, I felt like I had the information I needed. I would have much preferred to have been able to meet with Sir Anthony Hooper. I was very disappointed that that could not happen. I did receive a letter from him, which I was able to refer to in the debate with some basic numerical information, but that was a disappointment. But knowing what I know now, I was absolutely not properly briefed for the debate. At that point, Richard Callard knew from his presence on Project Sparrow that there had been moves afoot for 8 months by that point to reduce the role of second sight, which had never been mentioned to me. And it should have been mentioned when I returned from maternity leave. It should have been mentioned to me in the autumn when I was being briefed on this. But even if it hadn't been mentioned then, it absolutely should have been mentioned to me when I was preparing for a Westminster Hall debate on this issue. Whereas you will see from my comments, I was still and remained and was of the view that Second Sight's report and that process was incredibly important, and I referred to that in my remarks in the debate.
Can we turn to UKGI 402896? By the 22nd of December, you have received a letter from Alan Bates, and he raises concerns in the first paragraph. He says, following the debate, I thought I should write to you once more to offer to meet with you to discuss the issues involved with this matter from the perspective of those it has affected, rather than those who seem to be so desperately trying to keep the truth from you. Can you assist us with those who advised you, what their general approach was towards letters from Alan Bates?
Well, the general approach was to draft a response. I would often only see the letter when a draft response had been put together. And those draft responses, at different times during my tenure as minister, would be either more or less sort of helpful. So in the early part of my ministerial role, there was, the Second Sight report underway, and then we had the working group recently having been set up, so there was some positive sort of engagement happening. And I think by this point, it was much less positive in terms of the drafted reply, and indeed that was delayed in being sent because the follow-up from the debate did not happen, in my view, in anything like the way that it should have done. We had a debate on the 17th of December. Sir Alan Bates wrote a letter on the 22nd of December. He was on it despite the run-up to Christmas. Immediately after the debate, I had as would normally be the case, a huddle, if you like, with my officials to try to agree some next steps. And one of the particular issues that I had, or ideas that I had suggested, was that we should extend an offer to MPs who had just been questioning me and making their points forcefully in a debate, that we should offer to them to be able to be involved in being privy to the information in the working group and the mediation process, obviously for their specific constituent, and obviously only if that specific constituent was happy with that situation. And my understanding from that huddle after the debate was that this would be taken forward by Post Office Limited in terms of them writing to each MP about the issues raised and making that offer. I remember that I had chased it in early January, I think on the 7th of January.
Let me take you to January.
Sure.
Let's move to January the 7th, UKGI 402920. The bottom email, I think, might be the one you're referring to. And it's an email from your private office to Richard Callard. Joe is asking me what the timeline for getting advice from the Post Office on the next steps following the Horizon debate would be. And the response is above. things in train, for example, Post Office are preparing a line-by-line rebuttal. We are liaising with the Post Office to write a letter to MPs who attended the debate. We are also seeking to prepare a Mythbusters type document. And then there is a Horizon Board subcommittee at Post Office on Monday, which I'm going to, which will plot out the way forward. And we will update Jo next week when we see her. Could we please turn to UKGI 403007? We're now on the 15th of January. So another week has passed. This is an email from Mark Davies, who's the head of communications at the Post Office, emailing your private office. And he says, I'm writing to send you a note attached setting out the Post Office's detailed response to the allegations made by a number of MPs in Parliament during the Westminster Hall debate on the mediation scheme in December. You may, of course, wish to table this in Parliament. Subject to your view, we will also publish this response on our website. Now, I asked you earlier about an email where members of the Post Office were copied into a distribution list with your private office. Is it usual for a head of communications from a company like the Post Office to be emailing your private secretary and to suggest that you may wish to table something in Parliament?
I think sometimes people from Post Office Limited would contact my office if they were sending a briefing note or information. I can see that they might do that. The Director of Communications, perhaps more unusual, but I think this is probably in the context of me knowing that a note was being created by Post Office in response to the debate. So, I mean, that's not particularly concerning to me. It's a formal email. What was concerning to me at the time, I mean, I was actually pretty furious that, I mean, this is the 15th of January. The debate was on the 17th of December, right? And, like most of us, okay, yeah, took Christmas Day off and, had some time with the family, but, we're working hard. Sir Alan Bates was working hard, sending a letter on the 22nd of December. And the fact that Post Office hadn't, pulled the finger out to get this response sorted quicker than basically 4 weeks after the debate felt to me to be, ridiculous. And I remember actually, I think it was a couple of days before this, I vividly remember a kind of conversation where I was basically told that the letter still hadn't been sent. And I couldn't really understand it. And I just want to explain also why I was so interested in the concept of MPs being able to see the details that were...
If you could explain quite briefly, because we're slightly out of time.
So one of the challenges here was trying to work out where the truth lay. So I just had a Westminster Hall debate where MPs were forcefully putting forward points on behalf of their constituents and receiving entirely different story from the Post Office. And that was very difficult for me. I couldn't go into each case and start looking through spreadsheets and try to work out, I didn't have the skill set to do that, and try to work out who was right and who was wrong. But it was clear that they couldn't both be right. And I did think that MPs being in a position where they could at least be privy to that information would result in one of two things. Either, if the Post Office were right and they had a very strong case against these sub-postmasters, that information being presented to those MPs, some of those MPs would say, fair enough, actually, I see your case. Or that would not be the case, and so the MPs would be able to respond with even more confidence that, having objectively looked at it, that wasn't, what Post Office was saying was wrong. So that was why I thought that was a particularly important intervention.
Let's turn to your response to Mr. Bates, and that is UKGI 403111. So we're now on the 28th of January. If I could read just from the first big paragraph on the first page, it ends, the system processes 6 million transactions nearly every working day, the same lines as we've seen previously, 500,000 users, etc. At the bottom, with regard to your point about Post Office taking control of the scheme and withholding information, it would seem to me that Second Sight have spent more than 2 years investigating the cases. It's rather dismissive in tone. Would you agree with that?
It clearly has quite a lot of information, but you're right that quite a chunk of that is information that was used in previous circumstances, and it's definitely not taking the letter as seriously as I think required. Now,
are you aware of who drafted that letter?
I mean, I don't know exactly. I would imagine that it would have had final sign-off by Richard Callard. It may well be that one of his team produced an earlier draft.
Knowing what you knew by that stage, do you consider that this was an appropriate response to have sent?
Well, knowing at the time, what I should have done is agree to the meeting with Sir Alan Bates. I really regret that I did not do that.
And why did you
I'm
not
sorry
do
about
that? Very briefly.
I was being advised not to, from the perspective of the working group, confidentiality and different participants. And as I say, Sir Anthony Hooper declining to meet with me reinforced that perspective somewhat. On a personal note, I'd recently come back from maternity leave, the same number of waking hours. Previously, I spent almost every waking hour working, either in the ministerial brief or in the constituency, and I now had some additional responsibilities in my waking hours that needed to be fitted in. So additional meetings were not, pushing back on taking more meetings than I was being advised to do was not really top of my agenda, but I should have done so, and I do regret that.
I'm going to move on now to the termination of Second Sight. At paragraph 74 of your witness statement, I don't think we need to bring it up on screen, you refer to a table being shown to you by Mr. Callard in relation to that. If we could bring onto screen poll 00102-169. In your statement, you've said you haven't seen a copy of that table. This is a document that would have been provided to you subsequently to your statement. Is this the document that you were referring to?
I can't be certain, but not least because it was waved in front of my face rather than something that I had to look at overnight in a box. But I think it's certainly quite possible that it could have been.
So I think in your statement you said you had no idea of the risks involved in relation to ending the mediation scheme. This is a document that addresses risks, but you've described it as something that was waved in front of your face. Can you briefly assist us on what you mean by waved in front of your face?
That we were in a meeting, a verbal discussion meeting, and I think, as I say in my statement, Richard Callard said that he shouldn't be showing me this, but he briefly did show me a document, and he was giving the impression that he was being extra helpful by showing me, additional information. And it doesn't, having looked at it now, it doesn't talk about the risks of removing Second Sight. That was not the way in which it was presented to me in that meeting or subsequently in the documentation that I received.
Thank you. And let's look at the draft submission and a later submission. Can we turn to UKGI 403390? Now, this should be a document that allows us to see some track changes or some comments, and I will scroll down in a second. Let's just read. So this is a draft submission to you from Laura Thompson. Was she a member of the SHEX team?
Yes, she was.
Purpose: to update you on the current state of the Post Office mediation scheme, dealing with complaints about the Horizon system, and seek your agreement to the Post Office's proposed approach in light of likely steps. And then there's a recommendation that you note the current steps and agree to the Post Office's approach. If we scroll down, we can see there's reference to Second Sight. It remains the case that there's no evidence of systemic issues with Horizon system that can cause the discrepancies. Rather, in most cases, they've been investigated. The discrepancies appear to have been caused by human error. If we go over the page, please. We can see here, this is the hidden content. So these are the comments in comment boxes on the draft. And it's in relation to that first part that I took you to, the part about seeking your agreement. And the comment there is, are we seeking her agreement? And Mr. Callard says, probably not at this stage. Think it is more of a citing submission. And if she objects, she would no doubt say, and it's not her scheme. What is your view on that?
They should have sought my agreement. It was a very significant issue and a very significant change. And this draft document on the 25th of February, which was ultimately sent to me on the 4th of March, was markedly different from what finally was sent to me.
And perhaps we could scroll down over to the next page. We can see some passages that don't ultimately appear. It's paragraph 9, I think, that you've highlighted in your statement, where it says the advantages of the approach, that is mediating all cases remaining in the scheme and releasing Second Sight from their engagement with the Post Office, is that it renders the whole of the working group redundant, and it reduces the scope for Second Sight or the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance to continue to broaden the scope of the scheme. However, it will need careful handling with both participants and the media to avoid the implication that the Post Office are seeking to hide the truth or gag Second Sight. And if we scroll down to the bottom of the page, there is another part that ultimately comes out, which is we therefore recommend supporting the Post Office's proposed approach, but it might get choppy. If we scroll over the page, paragraph 14, it says there, whether leaked or not, the Second Sight final report will give the Post Office a hook to determine that it's time to amend the terms of Second Sight's engagement and limit their involvement to reviewing the specific individual cases remaining in the scheme. Post Office are considering optimal timing, including a preemptive strike. Could we please turn now to UKGI, I think it's 6032. This is the final version of that submission. We also have it, I don't need to bring it up, but we also have it at UKGI 000141168. So can you assist us with how the final version causes you concerns?
So the initial version was going to ask for my agreement for the changes that were being made by Paul to close the working group and mediate all cases. But the version that I received does not ask me to agree it. It asks me to note those changes. Then it directs me to agree about not telling Parliament about this by written ministerial statement, but that this is a finely balanced decision. And that sort of screams, this is the bit you need to look at, worry about whether or not to lay a written ministerial statement. The reference to Second Sight in the initial version talks about limiting their involvement, discusses about it getting choppy, that they might be considered to have been gagged. And the version that I received does mention very briefly that their engagement would be terminated, but in the context of that being a kind of natural consequence of the ending of the working group, and that their ongoing engagement would be there in terms of being funded to investigate individual cases and also to complete their report. There is nothing that is mentioned about them being asked to destroy documents. And the comments, there's also a comment where one of the civil servants speculates whether or not we should just ask me to consider whether my commitments to Parliament have been met, because it would free us from having to worry about it, which I thought was rather disrespectful to Parliament and to therefore the constituents of the members of Parliament. Obviously civil servants should be taking very seriously commitments that ministers have made to Parliament. Now, in the end, they did produce that information. It's a total changing of this submission. So from reading this, did I know that Post Office were going to end the working group, mediate all cases, apart from criminal cases, that would then be referred to the Criminal Cases Review Commission? Yes, I knew that. But did they tell me that they were going to sack Second Sight and make them destroy documents? No. Did they tell me that actually they'd been discussing limiting and reducing the role of Second Sight for the previous 10 months or so? No. If they had said that, would I have responded differently? Yes. And do I think that's why they didn't put that information in the submission? Also yes.
Thank you. There's one final document that I'm going to ask you about, and I'll show you a couple of emails that relate to the way that it became drafted. It's POL 00132580, and it is a letter to yourself from Paula Vennells, dated the 9th of March 2015. You've said in your statement this was something that you requested, is that correct?
Yes, so I did agree to make the written ministerial statement that I was advised not to make, and that the best way to do that would be to be making a ministerial statement, including a letter from Paula Vennells, and that was a common way of making a ministerial statement, to be able to bring information into the official records of Parliament.
And the letter says as follows: I'm pleased to say that Post Office Limited has now completed investigations into all the individual cases put forward for consideration in the scheme. Furthermore, again, I'm pleased to confirm that no evidence has been found through these investigations of any system-wide issues with Horizon. As a result, Post Office has now decided to put forward for mediation all cases remaining in the scheme, except those that have been subject to a previous court ruling. This will accelerate the conclusion of the scheme in the interests of the applicants and ensure that we fulfil the commitments we made to them at the outset. It says the Post Office will also continue to seek to make an independent review by forensic accountants Second Sight available to applicants where that has not already been provided. And over the page, please. This is one of the key paragraphs that I'm going to briefly be asking you about. For those applicants who have been subject of court rulings, two important points need to be drawn out. Firstly, we will continue to consider each of these cases carefully on a case-by-case basis, even though mediation cannot overturn a court's ruling. Secondly, as a prosecutor, Post Office has a continuing duty after a prosecution has concluded to disclose immediately any information that subsequently comes to light which might undermine its prosecution case or support the case of the defendant. Having now completed its reinvestigation of each of the cases, Post Office has found no reason to conclude that any original prosecution was unsafe. Applicants remain able to pursue the normal legal avenues open to them to appeal court rulings with any further material disclosed to them, including that produced through the scheme. And if we scroll down towards the end, it says the approach set out above will help bring the mediation process to a conclusion earlier than envisaged. One of the consequences of our presumption in favour of mediating is, as many cases as possible, that it brings to an end the role of the working group. And I'd just like to take you through the process by which that was drafted. If we look at POL 00386985, we can see there that Mr. Davis, the Communications and Corporate Affairs Director at the Post Office, circulates internally a draft. We then see at POL 00223650 an amendment to the draft. Thank you. If we scroll down, we can see from Mr. Williams, he makes 2 points. The 4th paragraph, final sentence, change it to the Post Office will also continue to seek to make an independent review available, etc. We may not be able to actually deliver the independent review once second sight are terminated. And then fifth final sentence, to having now completed its reinvestigation of each of the cases, Post Office has found no reason to conclude that any original prosecution was unsafe. We should avoid talking about appeals which have not yet been made. And we can actually see in track changes that change. Could we please turn to poll 002233651? Thank you. This is the amended draft, and if we turn to the second page, please, the end of the first paragraph, we can see that track change. So it originally said, however, Post Office has not seen any evidence that it believes would lead to a successful appeal, and that is now amended to, having now completed its reinvestigation of each of the cases, Post Office has found no reason to conclude that any original prosecution was unsafe. And we saw that form of words in the letter that was tabled before Parliament. Can you assist us with what your understanding of that was at the time?
So, having received this letter, which, without having seen the track changes, is a very specific, confident, robust letter that says, you know, we've investigated, we've looked at this, we've got this duty to disclose, immediately any information that comes to light would be disclosed, and of course there's all these avenues for appeal, and you know, there's no reason to conclude that any original prosecution was unsafe. That, to me, felt very reassuring, and I just want to be clear as well that this was not only a set of assurances that were given to me in writing. These were assurances that Paula Vennells delivered to me in person, you know, across the table, looking me in the eye and telling me that there was no problem, that they had investigated, that they had not found anything that would cause concern, which I cannot square with that email that I have now seen that she sent in October 2013 that says that she is, you know, her concern is about an unsafe witness. And their obligations of disclosure, you know, so she knew about the Clark advice and the lack of credibility of the key witness that they had relied on for so many prosecutions. I mean, I consider that she did not tell me that at the time in the summer and autumn of 2013 to be massively problematic, nor at any point in the subsequent 18 months, in any of our catch-ups, in any of the submissions that I received, and that she would sit and look me in the eye and give me those assurances and then put that in writing. You know, it just beggars belief, because she knew that there were problems with convictions and the safety thereof, because she had been told that in the Clark memo. And I got this letter, and I did take it at face value. I believed the assurances. And, you know, in that first briefing note, where I met with Alice Perkins and Paula Vennells in 2012, one of the bullet points, which I remember because it was unusual, was that Paula Vennells is also an ordained vicar, right? And so she was sitting there, yes, as the chief exec of a national organisation, national company, but she was also sitting there with the moral authority, you know, of somebody who was a minister of the cloth, right? Not of some kind of, you know, slick chief executive who seemed to care only about profit. I believed her. I believed her.
Could we please, I did say that was the final document, but just one more document. It's UKGI 404006. And we can deal with this quite quickly. If we start on page 3, we see on page 3, on the 20th of March 2015 now, there is a request from yourself in respect of, you had been told, I think, that it wasn't appropriate to receive a copy of Second Sight's report. I think that was, if we turn to page 2, we can see that you had challenged that. And at the
multiple times.
Bottom of that page, that email from Laura Thompson, she says, our advice remains that government should not receive a copy of the report. The revised drafting emphasises 2 points. it'll be sent to the post office. It doesn't relate to the operation of the Horizon system, but rather relates to issues which will be operational matters for the post office. Now, we started today on the distinguishing between operational matters and what were not operational matters. Do you think that the second site report that isn't being provided to you here, do you think that's an operational matter or something else?
Well, I think it's hard to know, having not received it, obviously. But I think clearly this is an issue where there is significant concern in Parliament and more broadly in the public, many sub-postmasters. And the Select Committee in Parliament has recommended that government receive a copy. I remember an earlier piece of correspondence, I think to Sir Ellen Bates, where I was asked to sign off that the government cannot compel its publication, nor would we do so. And I remember challenging that and saying, well, hang on, if we could compel it, I think I would compel it to be published. Can we compel it? And I was told, no, we can't. And then they said because of the confidentiality, which, I accepted. But the confidentiality argument falls apart with the provision of it to government as the shareholder. So I felt like that was an important report that should be received by government.
Thank you. Finally, it might be suggested that politicians are coming to this inquiry, finding it very easy to blame the post office, very easy to blame civil servants, but don't look enough at their own roles. What do you think you did to contribute to the scandal?
There's various things that I wish I had done differently, as I set out in my witness statement. I should have met with Sir Ellen Bates. I wished I'd asked to meet with Second Sight directly. I wish on a couple of occasions I had pushed more and probed more. And one of those was when I was told that the Post Office was changing their prosecution policy. And I wasn't told that in a formal briefing. It was off the cuff. And I think my response at the time was kind of relief and about time. But actually, I wish I'd asked more questions at that point because I suspect that there were reasons for that. And if ultimately, if Post Office had been frank about that advice that they'd received, which I'm sure must be why they changed their prosecution policy about the unsafe witness, I mean, years of anguish could have been saved for sub-postmasters. Justice could have been years earlier if that Clark memo had been properly acted upon at the time. And I didn't know about it, and I wish I had. And I'm just really sorry that I asked lots of questions and it wasn't enough.
Thank you. So it's 1 o'clock. There are unlikely to be many significant questions from anybody. I'm just looking around the room to see if there are. Yes, there is one question from, one question from Paula Vennells' legal team and also from Mr. Jacobs. I anticipate it will be around 10 minutes in total. It's a matter for you, so whether we...
No, I think if it is 10 minutes, obviously it's sensible to complete it, subject to the transcriber being happy to do that, and then subject to having a reasonable break for lunch.
Yes. So looking around the room, I think it may actually be sensible if we take lunch. Might it be possible perhaps to come back at 10 to 2?
Yeah. Before we take lunch, Ms. Swinson, that there are references in your witness statement to you being aware that the Criminal Cases Review Commission became involved. But unless I've missed it, I can't actually discern an approximate time when you first knew that. Can you help me with that?
Of course, Sir Wynne. My understanding of the CCRC's involvement was around the point where I was being told that they were going to close the working group and that Paul had decided to do that. And they didn't.
This is 2015, basically.
Yes, and I now know that there was separate CCRC correspondence, but I don't recall knowing that at the time, and I haven't seen anything to suggest that I was briefed on that. It did seem to me in the discussions about the working group understandable that if a criminal conviction has been reached and that needs to be overturned, that needs to go through a proper judicial process, which is why the CCRC involvement to me seemed reasonable as a mechanism to deliver that element of the redress that was being sought by people who felt that they had been wronged.
Fine, thank you. So I've taken up a minute. Mr. Blake, what time shall we resume?
If we could come back at 10 to 2 because we finish early today.
Fine, yeah, that's fine.